Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content. This episode is mainly going to be about the draft and a big trade that went down. And also we're going to be having a live stream on Thursday, covering the draft around like 7:50. That's probably when we'll go live and get that thing underway. And it's going to be a live commentary, so not a post discussion. So a little bit different format and similar to our trade deadline stream. If you tuned into that, so please come through for that. You guys make it or break it. Say that every time. But before we really get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and Twitter at the OBT Podcast.
So I guess to kick it off, obviously we had a huge trade happen. Obviously, if you're watching this on Monday, this trade happened on Sunday, but we're recording this the day of.
Yes, sir.
So Bradley Beal, we've mentioned his name many times, over the course of our, podcast, this season so far.
Yeah.
We mentioned many times that we weren't necessarily sure, when he was finally going to get out of Washington. We kept saying he keeps saying that he wants to be there, but then every year it feels like always hear maybe he wants out. But this time he finally got out. We had talked last week in our previous episodes about rumors about the Wizards potentially engaging in a full-on rebuild.
Yep.
And it seems like that they're going to be headed towards that. So we had a massive trade happen. Shams Charania reported it earlier today, on Sunday, and so we have Bradley Beal going to Phoenix. Potentially, I think also I saw that Jordan Goodwin, is that his name? I think.
Yes, Jordan Goodwin.
Yeah, is also potentially included in the trade, but
Oh,
it's
really?
not complete. Yeah, it's not complete
Well,
yet
that's bad.
because we're gonna get into it as we're talking about it. But basically, Chris Paul, Landry Shamet, a bunch of seconds, and a bunch of pick swaps. That's headed to Phoenix. And obviously, no, that's headed to Washington. My bad. And Bradley Beal's headed to Phoenix. So kind of, I guess, early thoughts. It definitely feels like Washington sold very low, on Beal. It sounded like from a lot of people that, I heard guys like Brian Windhorst, and Woj and others, who cover the league. They all mentioned like that they felt that the Wizards probably weren't going to get a lot back. Beal having his no trade clause kind of had something to do with that. A lot of people think just because he can basically dictate where he wants to go.
Yes.
Unlike, because obviously, like, we know a lot of star players in the past have, forced their way to specific teams, but because his contract has a no trade clause, he can actually,
Yes.
do it, and there's nothing that the Wizards can do about it unless he's okay with it. So according to Shams, he, was kind of down to a few teams, right? So we saw Miami, which was rumored, but Miami wasn't interested in giving up Tyler Hero. They're more interested in chasing after Lillard, who maybe potentially could be on the block. Obviously we don't know because it
Yeah.
seems like he's always wanted to stay in Portland, but we'll have to wait and see. Um, and then in addition to that, we also heard the Kings, which was kind of a random sleeper one, although it was kind of also tossed out there that there's not really a clear, realistic pathway for that.
Right.
Um, so I didn't think that was going to happen. Milwaukee was also reported, as an additional one as well. And then of course, the other day right before, which was after we had done our podcast, it was reported that the finalists were Phoenix and Miami, and Phoenix was not initially on that list. So
Right.
Phoenix kind of came out of nowhere, sort of jumped in on this, um, and they got the deal done. So I mean, that's pretty significant, right? That you were able to get Bradley Beal without really giving up like any real significant parts of your core. Obviously, Chris Paul's a starter, right? But in terms of your core guys, right, he's much older,
Right.
right? Probably doesn't have that many elite seasons left. Um, so that's definitely a massive win for Phoenix. Obviously, you're in a position where you're very shorthanded. You have, very little depth outside of your starters. I mean, you have obviously when healthy a really good starting five. You just got to fill out that bench, which is tough because again, with the CBA, you're not going to be able to really pay anybody anything. So you have to basically grab guys on minimum contracts. And we've kind of seen, other teams try to build out their rosters in that way, right? Like we saw the Lakers do that when they got Westbrook. But obviously, this is a different case, right? Because this Phoenix group is much different. Also, they have four guys as opposed to three, right? And Westbrook was in a different tier, at that point. Whereas like Booker's in his prime, Durant's still in his prime, right? But kind of in that part where probably in a couple years he'll be out of it, but he's still in it.
Right.
Um, right? Aiton is still, technically getting better, although we don't know because his playoff showing wasn't that great this year. And then Beal, who's in his prime. So obviously that's a terrific starting, group. Obviously, so we can kind of, like I said, we'll go more into the Phoenix angle right now. Where yeah, that's definitely a big move. We know with the owner, right, or team governor, that he came in, right, and obviously made the first big splash by adding Durant, right, at the deadline, and obviously it made them, better, I guess, for sure, right. Obviously in the playoffs, it didn't necessarily work out. You had injuries, and probably just not enough not enough time, together realistically. But now you got Bradley Beal, so you got better, and you have a whole offseason, to mesh and kind of gel and kind of figure out how to work stuff. It's going to be interesting because they don't really have a real point guard. Um, so I do wonder how that works, right? Because we've seen other guys, kind of merge, kind of play together that are more scorers. Um, but usually one of them, at the very least, has pretty high level passing skills, like we saw
Yeah,
with the Nets, right? Like they had Harden, Kyrie, and Durant, but Harden's a really good passer. Nowadays he's kind of just considered a point guard, even though most people look at him as a shooting guard. But this Phoenix team doesn't really have that. You have some good passers for their positions, like Booker's a good passer for his
sure.
position, and so is Grant. But you don't really have like a real like game manager type of guy, late in games. But obviously you have some scoring. You just got to fill the rest of the roster out with defense, which is going to be hard, obviously. But then you also just have concerns because again, we haven't seen a team like this before, where your entire strength is basically dependent on um your starters. And obviously, then the other factor is these guys do have a lot of issues staying on the floor. If they can stay healthy, obviously they should be really good and be, one of the better teams, if not maybe the best team. Obviously, we'll have to wait and see what other teams do in the offseason. But this is a, pretty early start, in terms of getting stuff done for Phoenix. But again, it makes sense because if I'm not mistaken, the calendar year for the NBA in terms of contracts doesn't roll over, I think, until July 1st. So things that are tied into that, like the CBA, like the contracts for players, the following season, those don't come into play just yet.
Hmm.
So ideally, a lot of these teams and a lot of these players would want to do these type of moves before we get into free agency, so that way, you don't have to deal with a lot of the fallout from that. So obviously, there's a huge incentive to get this done. So and Phoenix got it done. So this is so obviously like you got to give credit to them for being able to add, an all-star guy without really having to give up a whole lot.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting. I'm looking at a stat right now. Just talking about the Phoenix side, there's three active NBA players with at least 500 games played while averaging at least 22 points per game, and it's literally Beal, Durant, and Booker. So
Right.
that's just kind of interesting that now they have all three of those guys, but now they're also going to be making what 130 million, something like that, combined next season. So that's kind of wild, man. I mean, the
Yeah, it's
positives are
also
there,
yeah,
but
you're
there's
right. It's
trade
definitely
offs.
also a very expensive roster too,
Yes.
which also has to be factored in because that limits the amount of flexibility. And again, if it doesn't work, you're going to be in real trouble because you'll be giving picks over, to Washington and I guess mainly Brooklyn, for a really
Right.
long time.
Yep.
I mean, and again, Durant obviously he's still really good, right? But we know he's getting older. He's got some injuries, so you got to get this done within the next season or two, in terms of winning the title, right? Because you got a lot of talent on that team. So there's gonna be a lot of pressure on Phoenix, I think, to kind of deliver next year, right? Because they've
Yeah.
had back-to-back postseasons, where they kind of fell flat on their face.
Extremely. Yeah.
Um, Right, and both times you thought that they improved, in regards to where they were from the year before, right? Because 2 seasons ago, right, they lost to Dallas, but they had a great regular season where it felt like they were better, than they were when they went to the finals. And then,
Right.
of course, this year, right, then this past season, they trade for Durant at the deadline. It feels like, they're in the regular season, they went undefeated without him, right? Then they take care of the Clippers in 5, albeit a shorthanded Clippers team. But,
True.
then you lose to the Nuggets, and you kind of lose and get eliminated in, pretty rough fashion again. Then you fire your coach. Um, I like the coaching hires that they've made in terms of getting Vogel and getting, I think, some really good assistants. So
Hmm.
that's obviously but again, I obviously we know they're going to be really good. I'm just really concerned about the durability of these guys, which you always have to be concerned about for like any team, but
Right.
just especially these guys because a number of these guys just have not played a whole lot these last few seasons. I guess for Beal, you could argue maybe if the Wizards were a better team, maybe he would have played more last year. I don't know. I know he missed some time with some health and safety protocols and a couple
Yeah.
injuries,
Yes.
but that's my main concern really is just, right now you don't have very many active players on your roster, so you really have to, get these off-season signings right. And again, you're only really going to have, if I'm not mistaken, minimum contracts because you got basically four guys all making max money, and not just max money, but like huge max money, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, so that's we haven't seen a team like this before. I mean, obviously you had Golden State, I guess, but also Golden State, I think, had more depth. And it just felt like they had more players that could do, other things, I guess,
Hmm.
right? Because, like none of them were anything alike, right?
Right.
Like, not that Booker and Beal are the same player, right? But
Sure.
like, they're both kind of like prototypical scorers.
Yes.
Durant's obviously a scorer, although he can defend, and then Aiton's a big. But then you have, when you look at that Warriors team, right? You have Curry, right? Clay, Durant, Draymond. They were all versatile, could do a lot of different things. You knew which guys you were getting a lot of, some pretty good defense from, right? Because Durant and Golden State was really good defensively, and
Yes.
Draymond obviously was elite
Oh
defensively.
yeah.
Um, I just, I don't know. I guess, like I said, I'm concerned about the defense.
Same.
I'm concerned about the health, but I know they're going to be really good regardless, as long as they're
Yeah.
healthy, right? Like, I mean, yeah, they're not. There's no way they're going to be a bad team. It just, to me, again, the regular season isn't what's going to matter for me. It's going to be about what does it look like come playoff time,
Yeah.
you know, and obviously we won't know that until we get there. And so that's going to be a while, but obviously this is a big time move from Phoenix because, again, like you had back to back seasons where you traded for some, big names, big guys, right? Making big splashes. So, this is, again, this is a big step forward for them. But, at this point, right, like they got to get it done because they're no longer, kind of like that, other small market ish team, that like it's a nice story, but now
Yeah.
they have a lot of talent. They have too much talent, to kind of come up short again, right? Because
If.
there's a lot of key guys on this team, that obviously are really good,
Hmm.
right? But they got to get this stuff done because you can't have a roster with this much talent and then come up short again.
Yeah.
And we won't know that until the playoffs. But on the court, they should be really good,
Oh
in
yeah.
my opinion.
I
Because
have no concerns about that.
yeah, because you got a lot of scoring, really good shooting, um, you know, versatility, particularly offensively. And obviously you do have size and length at certain areas, right? Durant's long, Aiton's, big. But again, you still need depth and you still need to bank on these guys being healthy. And, again, like, are they going to be healthy? I suppose they could be, but with Durant, I don't really believe that he's going to just have a really healthy season because he hasn't had it in a while.
Sure.
Um, but again, if assuming they're healthy, this should be an elite team. This should bar none be one of the best teams, maybe the best team in the league or Western Conference. But again, we saw when they traded for Durant at the deadline, right? There were some that crowned them, kind of like the favorites in the West.
Yeah.
Um, so we got to see it, right? We got to see what it looks like. But just on paper, like we've seen with a lot of other super teams, this should be really good. But it's going to be interesting because it felt like the CBA kind of eliminated, the new one coming in kind of eliminated this. But again, they got it done before it's taking effect. So
Right.
it's going to be interesting to see over the course of, because I'm assuming you're keeping this core together for multiple seasons, right? Since you have a mix of young and, because you only have one guy that's older, right? Because Beal's still
Yeah.
relatively young,
It's just gonna
right?
be so
Booker's obviously,
expensive, dude.
yeah, it's just a super expensive roster, no depth, and you got to have concerns about the durability. I'm just concerned with Phoenix in terms of they've given up they gave up a ton to get Durant. Um,
Yeah.
and again, obviously you didn't give up as much for Beal, which you shouldn't, right? Because Beal is
Oh
not
yeah.
as good as Durant. But it's just you've given up so much, right? At this point that if you don't get it done, like you're gonna be stuck in limbo for a really long time. So
Yes.
they again, like this is something that pretty much has to work. This cannot fail because if this fails, like that's going to be, really rough, for that organization because they've pretty much gone all in on, we're championship or bust now.
Yeah. It's interesting, and like I was talking about with the money stuff. Beal. I think he's what in his second year of this monster $251 million contract. But I know in like the last of those years, um, his option what would pay him like 57. So like that's a
Yeah,
lot of money, dude. Like they have some money concerns. Like, and my concern isn't the regular season, like you were saying. My concern is definitely the postseason.
right.
Because I feel like this team, now that Beal is there, it's not like, they got worse at all. I think they did get better. I think they
Yeah,
definitely got better for sure. I think Beal is better than Chris Paul.
yeah,
But they have thrown away their practical future for a win now kind of move. I mean, I'm not upset about the move. If I were to grade it, I would probably give it like in between a B or an A or something like that. You know,
yeah,
um, but this team definitely has limitations, and people cannot brush that off, because my main concern is probably going to be the bench come playoff time and the defense come playoff time, because that seems to be what hurt them, especially when they faced Denver. Like, that was rough. You could kind of tell that they flamed out, got tired, but it depends on the full season. Like you said, if they're healthy, rested, and they're good and they take care of their bodies, I mean, yeah, this team is probably going to be the favorite to win the championship. Especially as time goes by in the regular season. Once we see how well these guys mesh together, I don't think there's going to be any issues, because now you kind of have a three-headed monster that can attack you on all three
I'm not
levels.
concerned about the fit.
Exactly. Yeah, the fit I don't think anybody's really concerned about, but in terms of the Suns' future, it's kind of non-existent, unless they win. If they win and they keep the core together, that's great. But if they keep losing, like in the next 2 seasons, then this might go down as like one of the oddest and most like I guess rushed kind of trade move deals all time, because I
Yeah.
mean, you gave up your entire future for two guys.
Because at least with the Nets, like the Durant, Harden, Kyrie thing failed, but
Yes.
at the same time they were kind of able to at least recoup some of it back by
Right.
getting back what they got from Phoenix. But with
Exactly.
Phoenix, like there's no way of getting out of this if this doesn't work. Like in
Right.
my opinion, the like if it doesn't work, then you're pretty much probably kind of in cooked for a while.
Yeah.
For lack of a better word.
Yeah. And I guess we should probably move on to what the
Yeah,
Wizards perspective.
yeah.
I'm the Wizards fan, so this is kind of, I'm gonna try my best to be unbiased. But I do have to say I'm gonna miss Beal. He's a great player, did a lot for the community in Washington D.C. So shout out to him for sure. He will be missed. I don't think anybody will be burning his jerseys at all, even though he had a
No.
major say in where he was going. And that, I think, is one of the main factors of why everybody's saying, the Wizards, we got the shaft, basically, because, we have to look at what we received. We got Chris Paul, Landry Shamet, multiple second round picks, and a couple of pick swaps, maybe multiple. I can't remember if it was multiple.
Yeah.
So who knows?
It's a,
Yeah. And it's like, in my opinion, I think this was brutal. As a Wizards fan, this is brutal. This hurts. But in my opinion, I think we also just gained a salary dump. That's what it really was to me. I feel like the new management kind of didn't see um, you know, the value in paying, Beal, who's now almost 30, all that money for a guy who's kind of proven that he can't necessarily contend by himself, if you know what I mean. So that I think is played a huge factor in this. But the problem that I have is we didn't really get a draft pick that's really worth, getting excited about. Like, yeah, we got multiple second round picks, but those second round hidden gem kind of guys like Jokic are very rare. It's kind of once every blue moon, and I doubt that's going to happen in this draft. There's some guys that are pretty, have a lot of potential, but nobody that screams to me, they're going to be a two-time MVP or anything like that, or a franchise changer at all. But we've made a lot of mistakes over these years, especially in regards to Beal. Because here's my thing: I think this would have been better, maybe a couple of years ago. Because I feel like we clung on to him way too long in hopes of like maintaining some level of relevance, if that makes sense.
yeah, that's
And
what
yeah, and it's like what we were rewarded with, like one playoff appearance maybe, and then all of a sudden we give him a max extension. I don't think the max extension was that bad, but throwing in that no trade clause for some reason, I think that's what really hurt him or hurt us. So we were basically forced to give him away for nothing. And my thing is, if we rewind the clock, if we traded him maybe a year or two ago and started the rebuild a year or two ago, we could be in the conversation of having Wemby, because now, this is the year after Wemby's entering the league. So this is kind of rough. In my opinion, we missed the boat on it. We've definitely needed the reset for a long time, but I don't think this is the right way to begin it, in my opinion. But at the same time, I do understand the logic. I think they were trying to move swiftly with this thing, because they do have other decisions to make outside of Beal, and they made that pretty quickly. And I think this has probably been in motion for a long time. I don't think this happened overnight at all. I think this was probably happening. I'm not going to say, immediately once the Wizards offseason began, but, relatively close to the middle of the playoffs. That's what I would have to assume. And yeah, it's just frustrating because, now with letting go of Beal, we have to let go of all the memories, even though they weren't always great. He did stick through it, through thick and thin. But, sometimes it's just time to go and you got to look out for yourself for sure. And I don't think this is like the way that anyone really would have hoped for our rebuild to begin. Wizards fans and NBA fans alike. I've been seeing, people ripping the Wizards organization for this move. And like I said, I'm not too low on it, but I'm also not high on it just because of the return value. And that is definitely due to the fact that he has that no trade clause because he turned down Milwaukee, Sacramento, Miami. So he turned down all three of those guys or all three of those teams to be in Phoenix. And it's like, I feel like all three of those teams, except for probably Sacramento, could have given us a better return than this. If Ayton was thrown in there, then okay, yeah, then we could be talking about this would be a different story. I think you could grade this trade like maybe a B, just due to the fact that you'd probably have Chris Paul and also DeAndre Ayton. But Chris Paul is also potentially going to be, thrown into another deal where it's like I heard it's the Clippers, and then other contenders are also waiting to see what happens. So I don't know about that. So now we wouldn't even get Chris Paul, which I don't think is a major loss, but it's still a loss. But that's a part of the rebuild. I think that's what people have to understand. Rebuilds have growing pains. It's not going to happen overnight. Guarantee you, probably maybe 3 to 5 years will probably be better. But in the near future, in this season, the next, yeah, it's going to be a rough one and we have a bad history of second round picks. I've already explained that multiple times on the podcast, but most of our second round picks are guys we ship them overseas or they go into the G League and they never really develop. I'm really curious to see about the pick swaps because I think do they have lower picks than us this year?
So I mean, Phoenix had a better record than the Wizards, so
Mm-hmm.
Phoenix would have like
Yeah.
the lower pick, but I
Mhm.
think like it's not for this year though.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we'll
I don't know
see.
because we don't know the picks yet. We don't know what picks are
Right.
being involved.
Yeah, that's the problem. It's
In
so
this,
fresh.
yeah. But I guess kind of the like unless you have more to say, you can keep
I
going
mean,
unless
all I really have to say is it's a brutal move. And I'm not gonna say like the organization is incompetent because I think a lot of this was out of their control, um, especially since they had to cater to that no trade clause, which is why you see so few of those tossed around in the league, because we basically had no leverage. All the leverage was in Beal's hands, and he chose to go to Phoenix. That's where he wants to go or wanted to go. So now he's there, and we have to cater to that. And give him everything that he wants. So we got him to the destination, but we didn't really get anything in return. And it's like, in a rebuild, you kind of want to set yourself up better for the future. And in this move, I mean, I can't really say Shamit's not really going to help us that much. The second round picks are probably going to be overseas dumps once again. And the pick swaps, we don't know. And I doubt they're probably going to be hefty or hold any weight whatsoever. But, to grade it, I would probably give it a D. I was leaning towards an F earlier, but, that was just, the Wizards' rage. But it is what it is. I think, this was they could have moved on from him in a better way, but this is the route that he wanted to take. And that's really all I have to say from the Wizards fan perspective. But hey, we had some good years, but also some big flub ups and mistakes.
yeah. I mean, I think like a big part of the issue here is kind of like what you said, where it felt like that they probably should have done a deal like this, you know, in a previous season,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where like he's on a smaller contract, right, and he's still putting up big numbers, so a lot
Yep.
of teams would want because it
Mm-hmm.
felt like again we talked about it, it felt like that whatever team he goes to isn't going to have to give up a lot because he's on
Right.
a huge contract, like you said, he has a no trade clause. So that, and again, like you also have to factor in like but again, also like look at it this way, right? Like a lot of that was the previous Wizards front office, as well, right? So it's like the
Yes.
new Wizards front office, right? They've been allowed to, kind of, if they want to go in a full rebuild, which where they should have, which is where they should be headed. It's just they kind of have to clean up, the previous
Yes.
front office's mess where they gave him a huge contract with a no trade clause, Whereas like, without it, maybe they'd have a little bit more flexibility. Maybe they don't, I don't know, but it is unfortunate because again, he's good enough where you should at least get like, a little more than what you got. But,
Yes.
again, like you said, he held all the cards with the no trade clause so that he basically was going to dictate where he goes. And like you said, that's why, not a lot of guys have that. Um, because the last players that had it, I think LeBron had it. I think his last stint in Cleveland, but like the last couple of seasons.
Right.
I think Kobe had it during his last, big contract that he
Sure.
got. I think Garnett had it when he was in Boston,
Okay.
if I'm not mistaken, and he waived it to go to Brooklyn. And then I think Melo had it when he was in New York, right? So we haven't
It's
had a
rare.
lot of them. We haven't really had any recently other than Beal. He was the only one.
Right.
And you can kind of see why, right? Because again, like it gives it gives the team like basically no leverage whatsoever. And it's not like we haven't seen players that don't have trade clauses, leverage their way to teams. Because Durant
Right.
leveraged his way to Phoenix. We know AD leveraged his way to LA. There's tons of other examples. Um, but just in general, right? Like, it just puts the Wizards in a tough spot because it's like, you should be able to get back more for him. At the very least, right? Like, you are able to now jumpstart your rebuild. So I feel like it was probably also just to get off that huge contract because that would be the hardest way to
It
rebuild.
was
Because
a
then it's like,
salary dump.
yeah, exactly. Because it's also tough to take back, bad contracts,
Right.
for picks because like he's taking up like almost your entire salary. So that makes it tough as well. So that means that you have to sell low. Um, I just kind of wonder what they do also with the rest of the roster because we know, like, there's a lot of rumblings about Porzingis potentially opting in. Because a
Right.
lot of people thought he would opt out and, sign a long term deal this offseason. But a lot of people think now that he might opt in. So it's potentially possible, that one of two things could happen. Maybe he just opts in and then just enters free agency next year. Or maybe he opts in as part of like a trade. Maybe the Wizards move him, and try to get something back for him
Right.
you know, uh, if a team wants him. I'm curious to see like what the market for him would be because he had a good year, for the Wizards this year. But you also have to be scared because of the contract,
Yes.
um, his health, right? And then you'd also would presumably have to, give him a long term deal, if you trade for him. And again, with that durability issue, that's kind of a problem. If you get the version that you got last year, where he was relatively healthy and played very well, then that's awesome.
Yeah.
You don't really feel too bad about it. Even though, again, probably shouldn't be the second best guy on your team, which is what he probably would be if he gets traded to a lot just because of his contract. But if
Sure.
he's like your third guy, or something like that, then that's probably, fine, especially if your first two guys are really good.
Yep.
And then Kuzma, you also have to factor in because he's a free agent. We know he's going to opt out of his player
Yeah.
option
He
because he's
opted
probably
out.
going to get more in free agency. And then it's like for the Wizards, do they re-sign him at all? Because we thought initially, right, that like, you trade Rui because you're picking Kuzma over Rui Hachimura, but then it's like, well, is there a price point potentially where maybe the Wizards let him go, like and just let him walk? Like, let's say if he's asking for like 25 million a year, I'm not saying that's what he's going to ask for, but we know he's going to ask for more than he's making right now, like
Right.
13. Um, so if he asks for like 25 million a year, right, are you going to do that if you're the Wizards, right? Like if you're, as the Wizards fan, would you want to do that? I mean, I know you liked him in DC this year, but would you want to pay him like big money now that you're probably on the path of a rebuild, right? Like
Well.
maybe not.
Well, here's the thing. Like, and I didn't even mention this. We didn't get any first round picks from this Beal trade. Well,
Right.
I guess I technically did mention it by not saying that we didn't get him. But anyways, so it's like we didn't get any like star level players, any young guys with
Right.
upside or anything like that. And not to say that Shamit's bad. It's just we already know what he is. We know his limits. And he's not young, by my memory. Um, so it's like I'm very concerned about our future, but that's a part of the rebuild. And with Kuzma, I love Kuz to death, but if he's asking for too much, I think this organization has kind of already shown their hand in saying that they're not willing to pay somebody who they don't think is going to be a huge part in their contention, if that makes sense. Because it seems like, and not to
Right.
really make this about Kuzma and him as a person, but sometimes I think most NBA fans can acknowledge the fact that he doesn't seem like he's all too focused on basketball at times. Seems like he's focused on other things at times, but um overall, I wouldn't really be that comfortable giving him a max deal. So if that means we let him walk, we let him walk. And we have to potentially suffer for 3 years until another generational talent player kind of comes around. And it may even just be 1 year. Who knows? We could be bad enough to enter the draft lottery with, one of the higher odds. And it's like, okay, cool. Like now we can potentially build through the draft. And that's the process of a rebuild. But geez Louise, this is rough. Um, and there's so many factors because, like you said, we were just talking about Beal, but now we're on the Porzingis train, and now we're on the Kuz train. They have a lot of decisions to make, and I don't know. I think they will make the right ones, but we're not going to see it immediately. I think we'll grow to love the decisions that they're going to make down the line. I think that's the kind of vibe that I'm getting from this. But as a Wizards fan, no, I'm not willing to give Kuz max money.
Yeah. Like I said, that's kind of where I would be too, where I'm like, if he's asking for a lot of money, that's probably where you just kind of let him walk and just kind of
Hmm.
let him, probably end up going to a different team. Because again, like we know that there's a lot of teams that would probably want him. It's
He's
just if
rare,
you're the Wizards, do you really want to be the team, that pays him? And it's
right?
like, there's probably a price point where you're like, nah, probably not.
And there's
So,
politics with it too, because if you're
right,
paying him big money and then he becomes the highest paid player in your roster, he may start to think that he's the guy, the number one guy, which may not be what the organization necessarily had in mind. So there's a lot of factors into it, and it's rough. It's a business.
right, because I think he can be a solid player on like a good team,
Yeah,
but
we
I
saw it
wouldn't,
with the
like you said,
Lakers.
yeah, I just wouldn't want him. I just wouldn't want to pay him max money because I don't feel like he's a max player. I think he's good, but I don't feel like he's a guy that you should be paying 25 plus million a year for when you
Yeah,
don't have to, right?
it's the
Because
same
again,
thing
like
with
if you're the
D'Lo.
Wizards, yeah, exactly, yeah. Because if you're the Wizards, do you really benefit from that? It's just the differences with LA. It's like you're not in a rebuild right now, so it's almost like you probably will have to pay him
Yeah,
close to what he wants, unless like there's a scenario that comes up where you can do like a sign and trade, right? But with the
right.
Wizards, you're rebuilding, so like there's no real pressure. Like if Kuzma walks, right, then there's no real loss that you gain from that. Obviously, it's tough because you didn't get anything for him, right? Like whereas if you traded him at the deadline,
Yes,
right, then you could have gotten something back.
yes,
But again, like I mentioned, right, you have to factor in now it's a new front office, new management, and that completely changes things. Whereas, like again, we don't know what the previous front office would have done if they were still in place, right? They
sure.
would probably just run it back.
Yeah,
Just 'cause it seems like they were more like let's compete, and let's try to win games, even though they probably weren't good enough. But now we know, like you said, we know the direction, and that's kind of why I thought that the hire for the Wizards was good because it felt like that the incoming people, right, were giving the Wizards more of a sense of like, a direction, right? Because it was time, like you said, to go into a rebuild. They had some really good years with Wall and Beal at times, but obviously, like by the time they moved on from Wall, it was pretty clear. It felt like, right, it's probably time to move on into a new era.
yeah,
And like I said, I feel like it was a little bit too late.
yeah. That's
But
what I said.
regardless, again, it's better late than never, right? Because again, like the worst case scenario is if you had kept Beal, right? Brought back Porzingis, re-signed Kuzma, right? Then you're like a play-in team or like like a 11 seed again, right?
Yep.
And then you don't right, so you don't make the playoffs, and then you still don't get like a top draft pick, right? That's the worst place to be in the NBA, and you're paying a ton of salary for a roster that's not good enough to compete, right? That's the worst place possible, right? Because it's one thing to be a team where you're not good enough to compete, but not bad enough to get high picks. It's another
Yes.
thing to be that, but also paying a ton of money. Um, and that's where you don't want to be if you're the Wizards. So, and like you said, then the other factor is Chris Paul, right? Because it sounds like they're gonna try to reroute him,
Mm-hmm.
but it was just kind of interesting, right? Because remember, a lot of this started from we thought that Chris Paul might get waived. Now, obviously, using his salary to trade for Beal if your Phoenix is much better
Yeah.
than just waiving Chris Paul, for sure. It's just kind of a matter now of like, what do the Wizards do with him? Because that's I think why the trade isn't done yet because they're trying to find a pathway for Chris Paul.
Yes.
Whether it's another team that's okay with trading for him versus a team that's versus like no team trades for him, so they just waive him.
Yes.
Um, so I kind of wonder now what happens with Chris Paul because we know he's going to get moved. It's just a matter of do we think he's going to be, traded to another team?
Right.
So is he going to find a new team via trade or is he going to find a new team via like waive and then signing? Because I feel like again, I don't know how many teams would like love the idea of trading for him just because of the salary. I could
in the
see,
age.
like and it had been discussed about other teams like say Houston or San Antonio, right? These young teams with a ton of cap space, they could just absorb his contract without really having to give up anything in return.
Hmm.
Uh, but like if I'm a contending team that wants Chris Paul, unless I just have like players that aren't doing anything, I wouldn't want to really give up like a lot of pieces for him
Right.
just because I feel like it's a huge gamble just because of his age. So I almost, I mean, like you said, Chris Haynes mentioned that the Clippers are interested in acquiring him, which again makes sense, right? Because it feels like they've needed a point guard. Just like some type of game manager, to kind of make up, for when Kawhi and Paul George, maybe don't have it in terms of the one on one,
Right.
or just like even when one of them is off the floor, just to make it easier for
Just
them.
like how
Uh,
Westbrook like kind of worked. I mean, he's not, as traditional, but similar.
Right. Yeah. Just another guy that can take pressure off the stars.
Yes.
Um, so obviously, like you said, he's very different from Westbrook, but it is going to be interesting just because I do wonder what happens with him because I don't because we thought he was going to get waived by Phoenix because we didn't even know Beal to Phoenix was a possibility just
Right.
because it had never been mentioned. Even recently when we were talking about these Beal rumors before, right, where it was mentioning like him maybe going to Milwaukee or Miami, right?
Yeah.
Phoenix was not brought up at all um, until the other day. But now obviously with Chris Paul, now that he's going to get moved, now it's like is he getting bought out or is he going to get traded? Because I guess I'll ask you first,
What's
right?
up?
Do you think he's going to get? Do you think Chris Paul is going to get waived because no team is going to trade for
Ooh.
him, or do you think like that he's going to get rerouted from Washington to another team? Because I
Well,
feel like that's what's much holding up this trade right now.
I think, with the Clippers, I think, if they have high interest, that means they're engaging in talks. That means they're deep in talks. So it wouldn't surprise me if we get a noti maybe late tonight or most likely tomorrow or maybe even before the draft, even, um, that Chris Paul has been traded. And I wouldn't be mad about that because we're getting something in return. I think that would be the best case scenario. Maybe we get some future picks or something like that, or maybe a bench veteran guy. I don't know, something. I do want to feel like we have been compensated, somewhat, not fairly compensated, because I think that's kind of out of the question now that Beal is gone and the return that we got was so sorry. But I do want to feel like we did get, something that gives me some sense of reassurance that we will be okay. And it's so early. That's the problem. With a rebuild, you can't gauge it off of, you know, the first few months of it or whatever. But with the Chris Paul thing, I think he's probably gonna get traded. I think that's the most logical thing. But, like you said, the problem is the interest. We don't know the interest levels, but the fact that the Clippers are interested does speak volumes, I think.
Yeah. Like I said, I just don't know because again, like realistically, I just don't know how many teams would want to trade for him. But we just saw the Wizards, trade Bradley Beal for Chris Paul. So I
Right.
mean, anything could happen at this point. Like I said, I guess for the Clippers, um, you know, or even any other team, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's say it's like the other LA team, the Lakers, right? Or say it's
Sure.
like Boston or whomever. You would think like ideally you would like to add him, for nothing as opposed to giving up stuff to get him. Obviously, for Chris Paul, you'd prefer to be traded,
Right.
because you get your money, right? In addition to going, maybe where you want to go, right? Because obviously we know, like, there's a pathway if he wants to go to the Clippers. There's a pathway for him to go to the Clippers
Exactly.
via trade. Um, and like they don't have to give up a ton, right? They could just move a couple of their more expensive guys on the roster, that they don't really have to have, right? Like you can move like Eric Gordon, or like a Covington, or Batum or somebody, right? Like
Exactly.
that. Yeah, exactly. Like they have contracts that they could just move, if they really wanted to bring back Chris Paul. But like you said, if you're the Wizards, you'd like to move Chris Paul versus waiving him because, like you said, you'd like to get back something. Um,
Right.
it would just kind of surprise me that you didn't get back anything for Beal, but you could get something back for Chris Paul.
Right.
Um, but at the
That is
same
true.
time, right? Like that, we know that there are teams that do want Chris Paul. It's just kind
Yes.
of a matter of be, would they be okay with giving up stuff to get
It's the
him?
money, man.
Yeah, exactly. Because like if I'm the Lakers, right? Like if I wanted to get Chris Paul, I wouldn't want to trade stuff to get
No.
him,
And we were talking
right?
about that in perspective of, the
Exactly.
buyout. So it's like it's
Right.
a different
Exactly.
animal.
Right, exactly. Whereas again, I can understand with the Clippers, right? Like you have other contracts of guys that you don't need, right? Like I said, I even forgot Marcus Morris, right? Like
Right.
they have a bunch of guys making money that they could just trade to the Wizards, and it doesn't really change their roster a whole lot, right?
Exactly.
Whereas like with some of these other teams, right? Like with LA, they also have a bunch of free agents they have to sign, right? They got to bring back D'Lo, they got to bring back Reeves, they have to bring back Rui. So the contracts that are still on the roster right now, right? Like it's like LeBron and AD. You're not trading those guys for Chris Paul. And then after that, right, it would be like Bamba or Beasley,
Hmm.
but they haven't guaranteed their contracts yet.
Right.
I think they have until around draft night, I think, and maybe the day before, to accept those options. But I just don't know at this point. So, like you said, it wouldn't shock me if Chris Paul was traded because I didn't think he was going to get traded initially,
Hmm.
and he did. So maybe he could get traded again. And like I said, there's definitely teams that could trade for him. So it makes sense. Because again, like if you have the ability to trade Chris Paul, if you're the Wizards, you'd rather do that. So if the Wizards can find a way, and I don't see a reason why they couldn't find a way, just because again, I could see a team wanting him, a lot. So maybe he gets traded. I don't know. Like I said,
Yeah.
I'm 50-50 on it. I'm not
Sure.
like I can't really like definitively lean one way or the other because I didn't expect him to get traded, and I was clearly wrong about that because he got traded or he's
Yeah.
gonna get traded.
Yeah.
The trade isn't official yet, but we do know there's a framework for it at least right now.
Yeah. And I think we kind of spent enough time about on this, and it really is honestly breaking my heart to keep hearing about Beal and the lack of compensation that we got. So I guess we should move on. And I guess, this next segment is pretty much our mock draft. We've kind of been hyping this up a little bit. So we're going to give our thoughts on pretty much the first round and maybe throw in some second round guys who we think could be potential steals or, maybe have um, some pretty good seasons um, and be better than, their listed second round projections or whatever. But, we kind of made our own mock draft each. So we're kind of going to run through that and give you the reasoning why we're putting them there. And I guess, we should probably, do you think we should alternate or do you think we should just give our lists and then
We might as well alternate because
that's
I think
cool
we'll
with
be
me?
able to get through it faster by
All right.
alternating. I mean, like,
And
so,
yeah,
and also like if we have the same picks, then we can just say like we have the same
right, right,
picks.
right. All right. So to kick this thing off, round one, pick number one. I think everybody and their mother thinks this guy's going number one, and that's Wemby to the Spurs.
Agreed.
No real explanation needed here. He's the generational talent. He's the unicorn. He's the guy everybody wanted. Everybody was kind of tanking, or not everybody, but some teams were tanking for this guy. And yeah, the Spurs are definitely going to pick him. I think he's obviously ranked number one positionally and prospect wise. So he's solid. I mean, it's scary because he's listed at 7'4", 210, obviously. I don't really have to go in depth with this guy, but he averaged 21 points, 10 rebounds, 3 blocks. The 3-point shooting is kind of low, 27%, but the potential is definitely there. It can be honed easily, I think, especially in that Spurs offense. Um, and yeah, there's really no explanation needed
Yeah,
for this guy.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. We already know, obviously he's been,
yeah,
discussed at length
yes,
by, pretty much everybody, right? That
yes,
he's, essentially one of the greatest, draft prospects that we've ever seen,
yes,
right? So again, like you said, he's got incredible length, moves very well. Like you said, the shooting percentages, are low, but we know, right, he's capable
yeah.
of knocking down,
Can hit him.
big jump. Um, Obviously, I guess if you had to say weaknesses, right? Obviously, he's relatively thin for a guy
Frail,
his
yeah.
size. He's got, that higher center of gravity. So we know like probably like the smaller, right, but stouter guys can fit. But again, like, the goal for him, obviously outside of skill development, just add on more muscle to that frame. It
Yes.
doesn't have to be significant. Um, right, because again, you don't want him to lose, his mobility or his flexibility.
Yeah.
Um, but obviously, like, from here on, like, we just know, like, we know that this guy for sure is going to be great. He's
Yes.
just got to be healthy, right? So
Yes.
we
That's
don't
the
really have
issue.
to get too much into Victor,
Right.
right? So because everybody's got him at number one. I think where
Exactly.
it starts to diverge, is where when you start to get to pick number two, right? Because we know that there are many people, right, who are set on the number 2 pick, but there are
Yeah.
some people that are split,
Yeah.
because we've seen it, right? And we know like after 3, right, it changes, but we might as well get into the second pick, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Um, so I guess right now, obviously, I have Scoot Henderson.
Okay.
Um,
It's different from me.
so yeah, so for me personally, I do think that Miller is the better fit
Sure.
for sure. If
Hmm.
you're talking about fit, just because, right, like we know, for Charlotte, right, you got LaMelo Ball at guard, right, and he's like, for them, like the quintessential guy that has the ball in his hands,
Yes.
runs pretty much all
Yes.
the offense. Um, but at the same time, like I'm looking at for when I look at Charlotte, I just feel like you're not in a position where can afford to just go for fit.
Sure.
You kind of need to go for the best available. And I think for me, I feel like Miller will probably be like the more versatile guy that's ready right out of the gates.
Hmm.
But I also feel like Scoot probably just has more potential just as a guard, as a ball handler, in terms of his athleticism and
Right.
his frame. Right, because he's got all the physical gifts for sure. And again, like he can handle the ball. He passes well, right? Because he's not like your right. Because some people have compared him to Westbrook, but I feel like his game is a little bit different, right? Because I think it's a little bit more controlled.
I think it's more
Um,
like D Rose, honestly.
yeah, I think yeah, exactly. I think it's more like Rose because I just feel like it's more controlled.
Yes.
Whereas Westbrook obviously, it makes a lot of super highlight plays, but sometimes it can be a little bit too out of control.
Right. Right. Right.
Um, and again, like that's the thing where I'm like, if you have him with Lamelo can sometimes be kind of out of control and a little bit wily. So I
Sporadic.
feel like, yeah, and I feel like for them, if you get Scoot right, then obviously you can kind of like then you can kind of like move on from Rozier, and it's not even that Rozier is bad.
Right.
It's just again, he's on a big contract for a while, and I feel like that kind of makes it easier to move on from him because they also have some relatively expensive salaries. We're assuming Bridges is probably going to come back, in some shape or form. So for me personally, I have Scoot, but
Okay.
again, I'm factoring in like it would not shock me, right, if Miller comes out of the gates and he maybe kind of plays better initially, right? Because we know with
Yes.
Scoot was in the G League Ignite, right? We know he averaged, like 17 and 6. And then with Miller, right, we know he played college for Alabama, right? And he had some decent numbers. He had, some rough performances, I think, against,
In the
comp
tournaments. Yeah.
yeah, in the tournament. And again, like the tournament isn't everything, but sometimes it does kind of like,
It's
factor
telling.
into yeah, sometimes it can be really telling in terms of how a guy is going to respond. But we know obviously at the NBA level, right? He's playing with different guys. He's probably not going to be asked to, do some of the stuff that he
Right.
was doing at Alabama, right? It's going to be a little bit, more simplified.
Sure.
Even though again the NBA is the higher level, right? But again, you got LaMelo who's has the ball in his hands. Rozier will have the ball in his hands. You got some veterans, right? So it'll probably be more of an ease role. But like I said, I'm personally going with Scoot. But
Okay.
like I said, I know full well going in that Miller could come in and easily really
Yeah.
be good.
Yeah. And for me, at the number 2 pick, I'm putting Brandon Miller there, and that's kind of just based off of what I think is going to happen, not really what I want. Um, and that's mainly just due to all the rumors that we've been hearing, the smoke after the lottery. It's just been a really convoluted mess in Charlotte. But, sleeping on it and thinking about it some more, I do understand their mind of thinking and their frame of mind. LaMelo, I think I'm not going to say he's generational, but he's definitely Charlotte's franchise cornerstone at the moment. So, they haven't had the best years, and that's partly due to the fact that they've drafted fairly poorly, constructed
Yeah.
fairly poorly, and have been managed
Agreed.
fairly poorly. But I think, and I'm not, let me preface this. Scoot, I think, should be and definitely is in play here for sure. It would not surprise me if he goes number 2. I think I would want Scoot to go number 2. I prefer Scoot to go to Charlotte, honestly. And I feel like, but with Miller, if Charlotte's doing what I think they're going to do, I mean, Miller is a good fit. I think he fits in Charlotte better than Scoot. And I feel like that kind of goes without saying. He's a 6'9" wing. He'd be pretty dynamic on the offense. The defense is there, I guess, but it definitely needs to be polished. But offensively, he's really good. Almost shot 40% from 3, almost 20 points as well, 8 rebounds, 2 assists. So, and I feel like he's probably the best available small forward for sure. Um,
Yeah.
but I feel like he is the third best in this class. But I think they're going to go number 2 with him just from their mind frame or whatever. it's an odd mindset. I don't necessarily agree with it, but that's what I think they're going to do.
Yeah. That's the rough part, because again, the rumors have definitely, kind of mixed some things up for sure. Because we even heard with Charlotte, right? The
Yeah,
idea that maybe they could, it like a lot of people think that they're leaning towards Brandon Miller, but of course we also heard rumors maybe they trade that pick for Zion.
yeah,
That's quieted down more recently.
hmm
But just the fact that that even came up, right? We have no idea what they're gonna
exactly.
do with the pick, and like you said, they've had some guys that were decent, like Lamelo,
hmm
and I guess Bridges, right? But
hmm
obviously, that's another story with him. But like you said,
Right,
they've also just had some other really rough picks, right?
book night.
Guys like say yeah, exactly, Book Knight, guys like that. Williams, the center they drafted, right? He's been fine. He's been
Yes.
pretty good, but outside of that, right? They've been pretty rough in terms of the draft, and they haven't had like too many super high picks.
hmm
It's just the picks that they've had, like you said, just haven't panned out well. So I don't know what they're gonna do. Like let's say if they traded, that pick for Zion, right? Like what if that happens? I don't know, but obviously we were kind of more sticking to the draft, I guess.
Yeah,
And like with my third pick, we just flip it, right?
yeah,
And obviously, I got Miller going there, as a wing, right? I think he would fit in pretty well with there. Just in terms of Portland, they need some, length and size and athleticism at that wing
I
spot
agree.
because obviously you have a decent backcourt with Lillard and Simons, but you don't really have much defensively. After that, pretty small, right? Grant, I almost feel like feels more like a three, just in terms of what he does defensively, right? But also like I understand offensively he's probably more like a four.
hmm
Um, but I just think they kind of need to up that defense there. Um, so that's kind of where I was leaning, right? Because
Okay.
again, like you said, 6'9" wing, pretty athletic, right? Shoots relatively well, does a lot of solid things. Probably needs work defensively. But again, with that size and length, he should be good. On both ends of the floor, right? Because those are the type of players that you really, really, really want. Especially if you're already set at the guard spot. Um, so that's kind of my thinking. Obviously, with Lillard, right? If they move on from Lillard, right, then Scoot makes even more sense, right? Because then you can kind of start off with the guard. But like I said, for me, I have Miller as the third pick, just because I feel like Scoot is the better prospect right now. Even though, like I said, Miller may be the guy that comes out of the gates, you know, and plays really, really well to start in Charlotte.
Right. And for me, it's like you said, our picks are flipped here. But I'm going Scoot, and that's mainly due to the Lillard rumblings. With him potentially wanting out, or not necessarily wanting out, but with Portland and Dame obviously exploring trade options, I feel like with that in the back of their mind, I think they're probably going to pick Scoot. Scoot may not necessarily be the best fit next to Lillard, but I think that's more of Lillard insurance. He's going to be great regardless. He's going to be great wherever he goes, obviously. Um, and I feel like, I feel like, Miller and Scoot are pretty much interchangeable. And I feel like he really could be a potential franchise cornerstone, but my thing is Charlotte would be making a mistake to pass on his star potential. Um, but geez, I mean, and honestly, if they don't pick him, if Portland doesn't pick him at 3, they're making an even bigger mistake, and I'm sure that won't happen. Um, but my
Yeah,
only concern with him is maybe the 3-point shooting, but it's not the
yeah,
worst. It's
no,
32%, but I mean, the athleticism, you really can't pass on that. He's a freak athlete, explosive,
yeah,
quick too. The quick first
yeah,
step is crazy. And he averaged
and that,
17 points, 5
yeah,
rebounds, and 6 assists. So that's a big
yeah,
factor.
exactly, and that goes, and athletically, right, that meshes really well with some of their other guys like a Shaden Sharp, like
Exactly.
Anthony Simons, right? They got some really good athletes,
Exactly.
on that squad. Like I said, the tough part is with Charlotte and Portland, it just feels like there's so much uncertainty with
There's
what they're gonna do.
rumblings.
Especially, with Portland, because again, like there's been so many rumblings about even if they don't trade Lillard, right? If they don't trade Lillard, maybe they trade the third pick, right? And then if they trade that pick, right? Well, then who gets it?
Right.
I don't know. So, that's kind of the weird thing there, right? But obviously I'm kind of going in with the assumption that all these teams are keeping their picks because then it makes it a little bit easier where I can kind of
Yeah.
focus on the roster. Um, right? And then we move on to 4. If you're Houston, this one's kind of a tough one. Just because again, as we mentioned, after the top three, it feels like a lot of these guys are really real gambles.
Hmm.
Um, so I'm gonna go. So I have Amon Thompson on here just
Me
as
too.
yeah, as sort of like a ball handling guard. I feel like that's probably what they really need.
Yeah.
I know that they have Green as a scorer, but I feel like with Thompson, right? Because he's a more natural, I think, type of facilitating guard,
Yes.
right? He's got better passing skills, better feel for that end of the offensive floor, right? Than say like Kevin Porter Jr., right? Kevin Porter Jr. and Green are kind of similar-ish players, right? Where they're both mainly one-on-one scorers that don't really do much else, in terms of playmaking,
Right.
right? Or or things like that on the offensive end. So that's kind of where I'm looking towards if I'm Houston, especially because again, right, you have other solid players, right? Because again, Green is still a good player. Shengun seems like he's going to be really good. Right, you got Jabari Smith Jr., right, who again had a rough start, right, but picked it up as the season went on. So for me, I think you kind of need to complete that right by going with that guard, that lead guard that you can kind of
Sure.
have in there. In terms of the athleticism, right? And obviously, we know that he played
Yeah,
for
I'm in
the
love with the
overtime
juice
elite,
and the
right? Which
Mary
is kind of more
Jane.
like that
I just
prep
fuck a tub
league,
like
right?
walking a different
For the
strain.
really, really young guys, right? More like the high school age players.
Yeah.
Um, and did pretty well in terms of, averaging 16 a game, 6 rebounds, 6 assists. The issue here, that's the real concern is that 3-point shooting. And that's kind of where I think where the concern really is, especially, as a lead guard, right?
Yes.
25% from three, even like 65% from the line, which would, also be kind of concerning, right? Because again, we've seen guys, right, that aren't great outside shooters, but, they're still solid free throw
Yes.
shooters, and maybe that's like a semi small sample size because it's at high school level, but still, um, I just feel like that part is kind of concerning. And when you look at his mechanics, right, it also doesn't really look like, an ideal shot, right? Because we've seen shots, right, that aren't super effective, right? But they,
Yes.
at the very least, mechanically are sound. Where it's like, okay, we can work with this, right? We know when Lonzo first came into the league, right?
Hmm.
His jump shot, his form was, really unorthodox, and it
Yeah, it
didn't work at
was.
the NBA level. It worked in college, right? But initially, it didn't work at the NBA level. So he had to really restructure his shot, into a much better, much more fluid, much more sound shot. Even though, again, it's not the prettiest, right? But it's much
Hmm.
better than what it was when he first came in. But with Thompson, right, it's just, it's just, unorthodox. And again, it just
Yeah.
doesn't look great. So he's got to really improve at that. Um, with Houston, you do have some other solid shooters, I suppose. But at the same time, it's very clear that they're leaning into that athlete
Yes.
team,
I
outside of
agree.
Shen, right? But because Smith is a pretty decent athlete. Green's a terrific athlete, obviously. I mean, they have other guys, right, like Eason, Kenyon Martin Jr., right? So
Yes.
you have a number of those type of guys, and it seems like that's what they're leaning towards. I just feel like I said, you need to get a facilitator, type of lead point guard,
Hmm.
because again, Kevin Porter Jr. has kind of been, playing as sort of like a fraudulent point guard, and
Yeah.
that's not really what he is, right? He's more of
Yeah.
like a two guard, right? Like I
Right.
know some people view him as sort of like a combo guard, I guess, but
Uh,
I don't feel like he should ever play point guard. He's not
yeah.
really that effective
He's
at
kind
it.
of
He's much
careless with the
better.
ball.
Yeah, exactly. He's much better just as a scorer, right? Again, he's kind of like that classic, score off the bench, right? Kind of like in terms like, a guy that plays with the ball in his hands a lot, one on one primarily. That's kind of what he's best at. He's not really a point guard. So with Houston, if you pick Thompson, I think that will help you, get closer to being a little bit more organized
Sure.
offensively. Because that was their issue also just last year. Offensively, they were just so disorganized. It was a mess because you just didn't really have anybody that could really manage the offense. It was a bunch of one on one guys, right, who aren't super efficient one on one guys. And that's a problem and again, with a young team, you don't expect efficiency, but you need a little bit more structure, which I think you can get with Thompson,
Yeah.
especially out on the open floor.
Yeah. I agree. And for me, pretty much the same reasoning as you. I feel like his athleticism is through the roof. Um, I feel like his passing and playmaking are definitely underrated and definitely better than his brother, who we'll get to later on. And I think that's really appealing, and I think that's probably why he's going to go number 4. And I feel like also something else that could be viable is, I feel like he also has the athletic ability to be an undersized small forward, but also bring up the ball. So more of like a point forward, if that makes sense. I think the athleticism is definitely there, so there's potential
Think
for
so.
him to play, multiple positions. Um, and something else that kind of factors in too, we do have to, I guess, talk about it is, Houston's somewhat interest in James Harden, I guess, in this offseason that could tilt their preference, I guess, per se. But at the same time, I feel like even if Harden is coming here or coming to Houston, I don't think that's going to shift, who they pick per se. But, I think Thompson is kind of the best available, but it is a huge gamble because that 3-point shot is rough. He's coming out of overtime elite. I think he'll be the first overtime elite OTE draft pick, which is
Yeah.
which is a big deal. I don't see a lot of people talking about that, but that is a gamble in itself. But the numbers don't lie. 16 points, 6 rebounds, 6 assists. That's pretty good if you ask me. And I think um, yeah, he has potential to play multiple positions. So I'm excited to see both of the brothers in the league. I think it'll be great. But I definitely have him at fourth. Um, and I guess to move into the fifth pick, these are kind of the loser. This is kind of the loser of the lottery. They fell pretty hard, and that's Detroit. Um, it's kind of rough, thinking about it because there's not a lot of options here that necessarily fit Detroit for me. But I'm thinking that they're going to probably pick Cam Whitmore, small forward out of Villanova. I guess you could call him a guard too. Depends. He's 6'6", 235. He averaged 12 points per game, 5 rebounds, but he's not a facilitator. I can tell you that right now. He averaged less than 1 assist, so that tells you everything you need to know. 34% from the three, a little shaky, but some guys are just like that coming out of college, and then it develops for sure. But I feel like this is more of an identity play for them, if that makes sense. He's a hustle guy. He's a player that I think the Pistons could definitely use. They need to form an identity down there. Um, and I feel like, him being a competitive wing could definitely reassure or like reinforce their culture, especially next to Jaden Ivey and Cade Cunningham, who I feel like they kind of have their backcourt established. They somewhat have their big slot established as well. So I think the next step would definitely be bolstering up that wing core. And I feel like, there's a couple of other guys that kind of fit that prototype in this draft. There's a lot of competitive, I think, NBA ready wings and power forwards for sure. Like I wouldn't count out Jerace Walker going number 5 as well. But, for me, I have Cam, and that's just mainly due to the mentality, and I think it's going to be an identity pick.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of agree. The funny thing is that actually I had them flipped. So I
Okay.
actually
Oh,
had
really?
Jerace Walker.
Okay.
Yeah, so I actually had Jerace Walker
Hmm.
ahead of Whitmore. And again, like you mentioned, like there's a lot of, really solid NBA ready athletic wings in this draft.
Yes.
And again, Walker, similar to Whitmore, he's got some, really solid physical tools as well. Physical gifts, right? He's 6'7".
Yeah.
He's a big dude. He's almost like 250.
Yeah.
Right.
He's
Exactly.
like a
He's got
baby Zion.
Exactly. He's got, a long wingspan.
Yeah.
I feel, and then with him as well, also he's really a defensive
Yeah.
guy, I think, especially in terms of being able to use that length and that athleticism. I feel like with him, again, the three-point shooting about 35% for Houston, right? So, obviously, it could use some work, but it should be a shot that I feel like should carry over at least relatively well.
Yeah.
Um, I guess the thing with him is that he's kind of in that weird in between where he's probably gonna play a lot of four, maybe in the NBA, because again, 6'7", doesn't feel like your typical power forward height.
Right.
But we know a lot of teams like to play smaller now, and I feel like he probably would be better if he's the four.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like with Detroit, you have a lot of weird options, to kind of work with because again, you have a number of big guys on your roster already, right? You got Jalen Duren, you got Wiseman, you have Bagley, um, amongst others, right? Not that those guys obviously, necessarily compete, because against him, right? Because he's, most of those guys are centers, right? Whereas Walker is more like a forward. Um, but I think that's kind of like where if you have them flipped, it's probably just how you view them. Because if you
Yeah.
view Walker at three, then you probably don't like him quite as much. Because whereas if you look at him as a four, that's probably where you really like him in terms of his versatility in these smaller lineups. Because again,
Yes.
Detroit's got some big guys. So and again, Walker, kind of fits that as well. But again, just having an athletic guy, right, with long arms that's got some decent skill, that's kind of where I have them flipped. for me, but I don't think you could go wrong with either one,
Right.
right? Like I think both of them should be really solid players. It's just a matter of like, positionally, where do you
Yeah,
see them?
exactly.
Because
Um,
Whitmore's like, kind of like a three, more like a traditional wing, right?
right.
Like 3-4, whereas Walker's probably more like a 4-3.
Yes. And I guess to move on to the next pick, this is pick number 6, I believe. And Orlando has this pick, and I feel like Orlando's in one of the better spots in this draft for
Yeah.
sure in terms of what they have in the first round, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But as for the sixth pick, this was a tough one for me because I feel like they're pretty much set at wing. I feel like Paolo is their guy, and there's really no way that you can obviously replace or get better than that in this draft. So honestly, I think they're probably going to make their guard room even stronger, and I think they're probably going to pick Anthony Black. And that's I guess he's kind of like a combo guard. He's 6'6". He played at Arkansas, averaged 12 points, 5 rebounds, 4 assists, 30% shooting from the 3 point line, which is kind of shaky. Once again, these guys are very raw, and we're talking college numbers, so the NBA numbers will for sure be different. But I think he's a great point guard, and he's like a connector. I think that's the thing.
Right.
He's a guy that's gonna probably gel and maybe even push some of the other guards on their roster to be even better because I think once he's in the league, it's going to be kind of an immediate. You're going to know what he is. I don't think the potential is too high. I think he's just an NBA ready point guard, and that's how it's going to go. And I think he's going to play pretty selflessly and definitely defense. He's a scrapper. He's a scrappy player. He's not like a great scorer, I'll say. He's more of like, I'm not going to say two-way, but kind of like point of attack where it's like he's
Right.
quick. He's going to get up in the grill. He's going to give his all on defense every play. And I think that's something that the Magic could definitely need. I'm not going to say he's going to be a starter or anything, but, he could be a solid rotational guy, 6-man. He could be a starter. We'll never know, or we won't know until obviously the season starts. But I think this is a solid pick for them. Um, and that's kind of really all I have to say about him. He's underrated in my opinion. He probably could have been better. I think in a different system in college, we probably could have seen more of his offensive game. But system wise, I think this fits. You do need to build around Paolo, and that's definitely the first step in making that guard room even stronger, especially pushing some other guys like Fultz, Suggs. You know, I just feel like that's what they're gonna do.
Yeah. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. I do like Black, like you said, he is definitely like a scrapper, really competitive, defensive type guy. I have him a little bit lower only
Okay.
because again, like, and it's not even because of him, it's
Right.
just
Right.
because of some of the guys that are on the board.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, I had Whitmore just
Okay.
because again, I feel like with these high picks, I just feel like they're probably going to go for talent
Sure.
first. With Orlando, again, like you said, with Whitmore, the fit's a little bit stranger because, like you mentioned, they already have a ton of forwards, right? They have Paolo, they have Wagner. Obviously, they have decisions to make on some other guys, right? Isaac's still there; he's still
Mm-hmm.
around. Right? OKK, I think, is on the roster, but
Yeah.
he's probably going to be, closer to being on his way out.
Right.
Right. So it makes sense, right, in terms of like adding another guard on the roster. I just have Whitmore there, in terms of the talent, because I just feel like, if Walker goes 5, right, I don't feel like Whitmore's probably just going to all of a sudden just start, dropping, in
Right.
terms of the stock. Again, like you said, it's a weird situation where like there's a number of like decent guys,
Mm-hmm.
right, after the top 3, but again, like I feel like it's gonna be hard like to just absolutely like just mess it up unless you just pick somebody who probably just shouldn't go that high. Whitmore obviously, he's big wing, like we mentioned, more of like a scorer guy, right? Some people feel like he might be kind of ball stopper ish in a way
Okay.
for some. Um, but again, like I like Fultz, in terms of his development, as a guard.
Yeah.
Um, obviously, in terms of Whitmore, right? Like could always use some scoring. At that wing position, as a shooter, right? Because again, I feel like Orlando needs a little bit more 3-point shooting.
Yeah.
So if he can get that shooting up, that should help. Just because again, right, Paolo, his 3-point shooting isn't quite there yet, right? Fultz, his 3-point shot, I guess, has gotten better from what it was as a,
Yeah.
initially,
Still
right?
rough
But it's
though.
yeah, it's still rough. Wagner's fine as a 3-point shooter. Um, and I guess Carter is fine as a 3-point shooter. But again, like just you can't go wrong with adding more, guys that can shoot the ball that can score. Just because again, like with that size, with that versatility, that should help out a lot. I do like Black. Like I said, it's just tough because I just have some of these guys, that are just kind of like in this weird range where, I feel like they probably should go higher, but it's just like I feel like some of these guys will get picked up by these other teams because they're just gonna inevitably fall.
Yeah,
But that's why I have Whitmore because again, like with Walker, I had him at 5, so that kind of messes up the board a little bit and makes it a
sure.
little bit different.
And I guess moving on to number 7, this is Indiana. Um, this is an interesting one for me because I have Jerace Walker. I have him a little bit lower than you, but I
Yeah.
think this is a better fit. I think I think he'll do better in Indiana. He played at Houston. He had 11, averages 11 points, um, 7 rebounds, 2 assists, 34% from the three, which is pretty good for a guy his size, I think. But I think it's hard because I feel like he's going to be in play, as early as number 5.
Right.
So I feel like the Pacers scooping him up at like number 8 would be a huge deal.
Hmm.
He's definitely NBA ready, combo forward. You kind of already explained what he can do, but I feel like he could be a huge, like, I guess, difference maker on defense and definitely adds a little bit of passing and playmaking. Um, that you kind of feel that you get with a guard. He's an interesting guy. 6'7", 250, but like he can pass. The assist numbers aren't necessarily there, but it's more about setting up things in motion. So I'm curious to see what the Pacers do with this, but I would probably put Jerace Walker there.
Yeah. Actually, kind of sort of zagged a little bit. I
Okay,
actually had Hendricks at 7
really?
for Indiana. And again, I feel like this is kind of a weird pick in a way because
Yeah,
again, like we know it almost feels like he's one of those types of players, right, that probably has like his skill set is already kind of defined.
yeah.
We know he's a pretty solid option at like that wing spot, right? 6'8", 215,
Mm-hmm.
play for UCF.
Yep.
For him, I feel like most of his strength is defensively.
Yes.
And I feel like he would probably kind of help fit in with Indiana. I feel like that they probably need a little bit more help at that wing forward spot because I
Yes.
feel like they were, watching them at times last year, it felt like they were way too small. Right? Because obviously Halliburton's big for a guard and Turner's, pretty solid for a center. But
Mm-hmm.
then after that, right, there were a lot of games where I'm watching like Andrew Neesmith, playing power forward when
Yeah.
he's, more like a wing guy,
Sure.
not really a four. So I feel like that would help Indiana out a lot. He's also a pretty solid shooter, for his position, which I think would help Indiana as well.
Yes.
Weaknesses, I guess he's not really like a creator, right? Again, he's more kind of like a role guy, right? Like a spot up, guy. He doesn't really create much of his offense, but I feel like with Halliburton there, you don't really need him to really do that much creation because Halliburton, is such a terrific passer, playmaker, right? He can pretty much, set everybody in Indiana up.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like with Indiana, like you probably just need like, kind of like that 3-and-D type wing that can move. And he's also very like versatile and switchable on defense because he also played a decent amount of center, small ball, in college, right? Obviously, I don't know if he's gonna do that as much at the NBA level, but obviously we know that means he's versatile and can defend multiple positions, which again is what you want out of that wing
Yes.
spot. So again, like you said, there's a lot of guys that are here. You know, a lot of them could be hits. Some of them could be misses. And so, like for here, like I feel like for Indiana, that would really help them out a lot because I just
Yeah.
feel like they're way too small. They don't have any real, bigger wings. They have some guards, right, and they have some bigs, right, but not really wings. So I feel like they need that,
Mm-hmm.
and that's where I have Hendricks at 7.
Okay. I can't really argue with that. I think that's a great explanation. And to move on to pick 8, this is a big mystery for me.
The
Because
Wizards.
yeah, it's the Wizards. It's a huge mystery to me, especially now that we have confirmed, obviously, that the Wizards are going through a rebuild. So if they're going through a rebuild, I think they're probably going to take a gamble, and I think they're going to pick Asor Thompson. That's the other Thompson twin. I think that's the most logical thing to do here. In a rebuild, you kind of want to pick the guy with the most star potential. I think they play very similar, the two brothers. And statistically, I guess you could say Asor is the better one, but Eamon I think has the more potential. I think that's kind of how people are viewing it. They say his game is a little bit smoother. Asor is a little bit stiffer with it, I guess. I don't really know how to explain it. You kind of just have to watch the two and compare them.
Yeah.
Um,
And
but
Eamon's just more smooth,
yeah,
more a little bit more polished.
exactly. That's kind of what it looks like to me. But yeah, like I said, it's a huge mystery, but I do like taking the swing on, the other Thompson twin. And I feel like he does have, the same upside basically, but I feel like Amon is a little bit more NBA ready than Asor. I think Asor is you're probably not going to see him take off in his career until maybe year 2 or 3 for sure. But scoring mindset is pretty much the same. And I feel like the playmaking needs a little bit more improvement, but I don't know. I think that he could be a do-it-all, I guess, kind of guard wing kind of guy. And I think that's kind of something we need. We need some sort of like some flash, something, something to give us some wow.
Exactly.
Definitely in these up and coming rebuild years. And who knows? We won't know. Like say Washington picks him, but down the line, they're still pretty bad, but he's good. That's a good sign, in my opinion, because then you're going to be building more and more. So I think that's what they're going to pick.
Yeah, it's actually hilarious because when I first heard, initially, right,
Hmm.
with the Wizards, I had them before I knew that Beal was going to get traded. I had them with picking Anthony Black, but then
Okay.
once I heard, that Beal was, asked out and but could potentially go, then I was with you, where I'm like, yeah, get Asur Thompson.
Yeah.
So that's who I have now at 8 because I had to update it,
Yes. That's
in the
exactly
last
what
couple of
happened.
days. So
Yes.
that's what happened with me. Because initially, like I said, I had Black, but then I switched to Asur. Because
Hmm.
like you said, now with the Wizards, it does feel like they're going into a rebuild. So it does make sense, to kind of pick the more dynamic guy.
Yes.
Um, with that probably has a higher level of potential.
Yeah.
Like you said, obviously, he's got some similarities to his brother, as an athlete, as a transition guy. Amon's probably a little bit more athletic,
Yes.
but they're both incredible athletes.
Hmm.
Um, I guess, like you said, obviously the issue there is the shooting, right? It's a weakness for both guys.
Yeah.
So that's the concern there, right? So, like you said, with the Wizards, it'll probably take him a little bit of time to develop. But he should be a guy, right away, that should make some level of impact, whether or not it's with the ball or in transition.
Yes.
Ideally also defense, you feel like he should probably impact the game as well.
Yeah.
Just again, his explosiveness, his athleticism. Um, Again, he's a pretty decent, cutter, in terms of, being able to play off the ball at times. But again, I look at him like you said, I feel like Amon is probably the one with the higher ceiling, just because he's more of like a lead guard with the ball
Hmm.
in his hand. And if he can figure out that shot, right, he'll probably be really, really good. Whereas Asor is probably, more of like an off guard, right, wing
Hmm.
type guy.
Yeah.
Where he's athletic, he can defend, right, do kind of all the other little things. But again, similar to Amon, that shot's got to be figured out, right? Because again, it's just he might be able to survive a little more without it just because he won't have the ball in his hands as much,
Right.
but he still needs it because again, like, if you're, a guard wing, it's pretty difficult, to be in the NBA, and succeed at a high level without at least having a somewhat capable shot. So he's got to figure that out. But like you said, I have him at that same spot. I didn't initially until,
Right.
it was
Me too.
until it felt like Beal was probably going to be gone.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, yeah, take the ceiling guy,
Exactly.
and I would have done it anyways. But again, some of it's based off of a mix of what I would do, and also what I think they will probably do.
Yes.
So
I
that's
agree.
what
Yeah. And to move into the number 9 pick, this one's an interesting one for me. This is Utah, so they have the ninth pick. And I have them picking Taylor Hendricks. I think this is a solid pick for them. He has range, for sure. He shot almost 40% in college. You kind of went over his stats already, so I don't need to rehash that. But he brings amazing, I think, defensive versatility and a lot of shooting, obviously. And I think he probably has, the movement ability to maybe even potentially be, a foundational piece around Kessler and Lloyd Markkinen for sure. And it's like, they also have Colin Sexton. So I feel like this is probably the most ideal fit for him. That may be a reach with him falling this far. We aren't gonna know until draft night. But between him and Jarace Walker, I think there's a competition because they're both power forwards, but Hendricks is 6'8", 214, so he's more of a slimmer kind of guy, I guess. Um, So I'm curious, but that's kind of my thoughts on Taylor Hendricks. I think he's a good fit for Utah.
Yeah. Um, I also again I zagged here. It was kind of interesting because I had him, around this similar spot, and then there
Hmm.
were also reports that Utah was really interested in this guy. And that's Bilal Koulibaly, who is Wenbanyama's teammate.
Yes.
For that French team. Obviously, he brings some interesting aspects to the table, right? 6'7" wing, super long, right? 7'3" wingspan, very young, right? Still, I don't think he's even turned 19 yet, or if he's not,
No.
he's very close.
Yeah.
Um, he's got some interesting strengths to him, right? He's got a decent level of strength, right? So he should be able to defend pretty well at the NBA level. Offensively, he improved as a 3-point shooter, but
Yes.
again, he's still kind of a streaky guy, right?
Hmm.
So, kind of have to see if it translates well to the NBA level. And also, it's more, again, it's kind of like, say, like who I mentioned before, a couple of these guys, he's not really like a creator type guy, right? He's not really off the dribble. It's more so spot up, right? Has to kind of be set up. But again, with Utah, like you mentioned, they have Colin Sexton. Um, they have an interesting, core of guys, right, with Markkinen,
Hmm.
with Kessler. They had a lot of lineups last year, right, where they basically had like 3 7-foot guys
Yes.
starting together. So again, I feel like, why not kind of consolidate that, pick up a
Okay.
wing, right, pick up a guy, right, that can help you defensively, while still being able to at least somewhat space the floor. Again, because with Markkinen and Kessler, that's a lot of size in that front court, right?
Yeah.
You need, like I said, somebody on the wings that can kind of guard those other wing matchups. So that way you don't have Markkinen, right, trying to, go out there and guard wings.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I look at it there. Again, there's parts of his game that are raw, right? Like as a ball handler, right? In terms of as a driver, right? He's not like a skilled finisher, right? More so just like, hey, I'm around the basket. I'm gonna
Right.
put it up. Um, so, again, he's got to add, more to his skill set. But I feel like I do like this for Utah because again, it just feels like again, you don't have a lot of like normal traditional wings, right? You
Hmm.
kind of have a number of guys that are kind of playing out of position.
Sure.
So again, get that wing, kind of to round out that
Hmm.
roster. You have a decent core, with some young guys, right? Ochai Agbaji, Kessler, who's awesome, right? Markkinen, who's really good, so kind of add to that core with that wing, right?
Yeah.
Just to kind of see where it goes, as because again, they're kind of in this rebuild era too, right? They, traded at Gobert and Mitchell, right? So their rebuild is a little bit different than some of these other teams that have been struggling more for a while, right? But again, um, you got the ninth pick, right? So, take that wing, and kind of go from there.
Yeah. And to move on, yeah, I like that a lot actually. And to move on to the 10th pick. This is a pick that's kind of been up in the air for a little bit. I think, there's a lot of rumors on what Dallas is going to do if they trade it or not. But regardless, I think, if Dallas decides to keep it, I think they need to go guard here. And I think they're going to pick probably Cason Wallace. Um, and he's a guard from Kentucky. He's 6'3", 195. Pretty good, I think. He averaged, around 12 points per game, 4 rebounds, 4 assists. Um, and I feel like he's a great defensive playmaker, and I think that's something that they need to focus on if they're actually going to build, um, using this pick. And I think he can play on or off the ball. I'm not going to say it's uh, Jalen Brunson levels, but it's going to reminisce. I think that's going to be a secondary creator kind of guy, and I think Kyrie's obviously coming back to Dallas as well, but this guy's not going to be starting. Well, depending on what they do, but I think you do have to go guard here, and I think he's ranked as like the 12th best prospect and 4th best positional ranked. So I think that's a good idea. He could be like secondary creator, but also huge playmaking upside as well. And like I said, really good on defense. So that would be really helpful to them, I think. I don't know what your thoughts on this one are, because this is a rough pick because everybody
Yeah,
thinks it's going to get traded.
exactly. Yeah, it is tough because, like you said, it feels like they're going to get traded. I mentioned earlier, where I flipped, Asar and Black,
Hmm.
so I have Black at 10.
Okay.
And because
Smart.
for some of the similar reasons, that you had him before with Orlando, right, where he's a guard, defensive minded, right. I feel like that would fit in pretty well with Dallas, right, because again, they need defense, badly, right, because again, with Luca and Kyrie, you're not getting much defense there.
Hmm.
You can be kind of versatile, right? Because we know with Luca, he can play multiple positions. Obviously, he's a point guard, with
Right.
the ball. but he's big enough, to just be on that wing spot, right? And you can have Black, kind of defend some of those tougher guard assignments, so that way it's not Kyrie or Luke having to
Right.
defend those guards. Um, and again, like you said, you mentioned some strengths, right? Where you don't need like a traditional table setting point guard, with this pick in Dallas because you got Luca, you got Kyrie, you got
Yeah.
solid,
Yeah.
playmakers. So you kind of need a guy who can kind of do the dirty work, and scrap and fight and claw. Again, the shot probably needs a little bit more work, right? Because
Hmm.
again, Dallas, they like to have a lot of shooters to spread out the floor. But again, I also feel like they need defense. But like you said, it's tough because it feels like they're probably going to trade that pick.
Yeah.
Right? That's what a lot of people believe they will do. Right? But again, with a lot of these picks, I'm kind of assuming that they're all keeping these picks. So for me, that's who I would take if I'm Dallas. Just because again, I feel like you need defense. I mean, obviously you could also go with one of the wings. But again, I don't feel like, if Black doesn't go, higher, I feel like he won't go super low. So that's kind of where I have him, compared to some of these other guys.
Okay. Yeah, I can definitely understand that for sure. And this pick I think is one of the most interesting ones. This is pick number 11, and this is Orlando's pick via the Chicago Bulls. And you mentioned it earlier, they need a pretty much a wing, that can shoot. And I'm going Grady Dick here. This is who I think, they're gonna pick. I know that's kind of high. A lot of people have him going a little bit lower, but he's a tall wing and he has the ability to shoot it. He shot 40% in college. He went to Kansas. Um, and he can do it successfully, I think, in a multitude of ways. Um, and people who shoot like Grady Dick, they don't come around very often. So it's pretty much tailor made for an NBA role player with room to grow into a little bit more, if that makes sense. So I think that's what they're going to do. And I think, like you said, they do need some bolstering up at the wing spot. And, that number 11 pick is pretty pivotal in terms of who they can pick here. So that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah. You had Wallace going a little bit earlier, so that's
Hmm.
who I have going to
Okay.
Orlando. Like you said, for similar reasons that you mentioned with Black going to Orlando, right? Just having another guard, right? Because again, you have a number of wings and forwards, right? So getting a guy, another guard in there, right, that can defend, at a pretty solid level, that can help you out and do a lot of versatile things out there. Because again, you pretty much kind of explained him a lot. So just in terms of your description of him, I'm just applying it to
Yeah,
Orlando the way you did with Black.
sure.
So that's who I have taking. That's who I have the Magic taking at 11.
Okay. And to move into pick number 12, Leonard Miller. This is who I have going to OKC. OKC, they're racking up the draft picks in the coming years, but I don't know. They could do a lot here because I haven't said that Bilal has gone, Kobe Buffkin. They all make sense, but I feel like Miller is one that's at least, on the board in this range. He was in the G League Ignite. He averaged a double double, so 16 and 10, 16 points and 10 rebounds. That is. And I feel like he checks a lot of boxes that the Thunder would want. Long frame, big wingspan, huge IQ, and definitely can play multiple positions. 6'9", so I feel like he's the most versatile fit, and I think that fits very well with Shea. And definitely can fit well with Chet as well. Give him some help on the boards. Um, and he shot 30% from three, which isn't too high, but he's 6'9", so it's like you kind of don't necessarily 100% expect that. And like I said, Grady Dick is more of a rare kind of breed, I guess. So that's who I'm going with here, Leonard Miller.
Yeah. Um, I guess for me, I actually kind of really zagged here. I actually
Okay.
had Lively
Really?
going. Yeah, the big man. Um, for me, Oklahoma City doesn't really have like a ton of, size.
Sure.
At that big spot. Obviously, you got Chet. You
Mm-hmm.
have Pokusevsky. Right. But in terms of like traditional centers, right, it's really more Chet.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like just having another big guy out there, to kind of round out that rotation. And again, we still don't know with Pokusevsky. Again, he's gotten a little bit better, but he's had some real issues staying on the floor.
Right.
Still really raw. And again, we saw, for much of last year, right, they went most of the season without having any real centers at all. Um, it's usually Jalen Williams, the big, right? He was playing, a lot of small ball five for them. Especially right because especially like as the season continued to go on, right? Because they had Muscala for a little bit and then they moved him, so it was really just him.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And I just feel like getting some, another big, can kind of help some of these lineups make a little bit more sense, right? So, as opposed to having, guys who are like, threes playing fours, and fours playing fives,
Right.
right? Then people can kind of slide up to more natural positions, right? Like,
Yes.
let's say, you have Lively, right? You could have, Shea, um, and you could have Giddy out there, right? And then you can have the guard Wing Williams out there, right?
Sure.
Or maybe you can kind of slide Chet over to the four, to kind of experiment, with some, really big versatile lineups. Or you could have, Dorton, Williams, and Lively, just kind of to experiment. Because
Hmm.
again, Oklahoma City, it seems like they're really leaning into having these really big, but also really skilled and versatile
Yes.
players is huge for a point guard. Giddy's ginormous for a guard period, right? But he's the two guard. He's 6'8". He was basically the tallest guy for most of the year.
True.
Chet obviously very tall, for a big, right? So I feel like, it again, like you said, there's a lot they could do here. Maybe they go, like you said, for a guy like a Buffkin, get kind of like a smaller guard, that can kind of, do some of those more perimeter oriented
Hmm.
things. But again, I feel like again, like, why not just, lean more into that size, and just kind of, add, up more big guys to your lineup because they do need some more big guys, I
Oh
think.
yeah.
Also, just in general with Chet, again, obviously, we know durability is kind of a question mark for him,
Yes.
kind of being in and out. Obviously, we know he didn't play at all last year.
Right.
Um, and like you said, there's a lot of different options that you have, here with this draft. And that's kind of like, you know, um, one thing that's kind of interesting about it, right? Where there's not like a lot of like bona fide stars. Obviously, you have three, right? You have three in a draft. That's really good.
Hmm.
But after that, you have a lot of guys that you can kind of plug and play, kind of based off of what you need. So it feels like fit here is going to really be interesting to see if teams kind of prioritize that just because, again, there's a number of guys that are solid. Um, in at different areas, but there's not like a ton of guys who do like a lot of things really, really well.
Hmm.
A lot of specialists, in different areas. So it kind of just is more based off of what you need, right? Like I said, I feel like Oklahoma City, again, they could pick another wing, but I feel like they're probably either going to go with a big or like a smaller guard. And like I said, I have Lively here, but like you said, there's a lot of variation, in terms of where these guys can go.
Yes. And speaking of variation, this one is kind of an interesting one for me. This is the 13th pick, and this is Toronto's pick. And for me, I think they're going to probably pick Kobe Buffkin. He's solid. He's a sophomore, but he's 6'4", 187. He's more of like a combo guard, point guard, two guard. Um, and I feel like they need to add to their backcourt, especially, I think this is more like Fred Van Vliet insurance, I guess. He's a combo guard, obviously, like I said, and he had a breakout second half of the season. He really showed his scoring ability for sure, and I think he's a willing defender, and I think that's something that Toronto definitely needs, and I think they're definitely have their eye on. But there's definitely other guys that could fit in this spot as well. But I'm just gonna go with Buffkin, mainly due to the fact that he averaged 14 points, um, 4.5 rebounds, three assists. He's not the best facilitator, but that may be due to the fact that his teammates weren't necessarily the best in terms of everything. Because I mean, outside of let me think. I think it was what Jet Howard. I mean, outside of that, that's kind of rough. But yeah, I think he definitely has like the scoring ability to fill it up, in every area of the court. And like I said, he's a willing defender, so I think that's a good pick for them.
Yeah, actually, it's funny. So I had them taking a guard as well for Fred
Okay.
Van Vliet insurance, but I actually had a different guard. I had Jalen Hood, Scafino, right out of
Mm-hmm.
Indiana.
Yeah.
He gives you some decent size, right? 6'4",
Mm-hmm.
kind of a combo guard. And like you
Yes.
said, I do think because Van Vliet's future in Toronto, is kind of a question mark, right? We don't know if he's gonna stay or, leave, right? We know he's looking to get some big money. Maybe that's Toronto, maybe that's elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
But regardless, I do feel like they probably need help at that guard spot. Maybe they take a big, right? They did get Pirtle, right? So the likelihood that they take a big here in the lottery may not be quite as likely.
Yeah.
But like I said, I'm rolling with a guard. I think he's got, pretty solid feel for the game. He's got some decent size, right? Because again, Van Vliet's a small guard,
Yeah.
whereas Hood's a lot bigger, 6'4" with long arms, 6'10", I think. So he should be, a really solid defender. Kind of plays with a little bit of pace in the pick and roll.
Yes.
Um, Again, obviously not the greatest 3-point shooter, right? Kind of more like a mid-range guy, and an in. So hopefully that can, get better, right? Also not like a super solid, great guy around the basket. But
Yeah,
again, you just feel like at 6'4" with that length and that size, he should get better at it. But I just like the fact also that he's just really good defensively. Not
sure.
that Van Vliet wasn't a good defensive guard. It's just, he's so small,
Yeah,
right? So that his ceiling, especially as he got older, is sort of capped off. So if you're kind of, saying goodbye to Fred Van Vliet, I feel like this guy's a pretty solid, replacement just in terms of, again, undergoing that youth movement. Cause it does feel like Toronto, maybe they don't get rid of everybody.
hmm,
Um, but it does feel like at the very least Van Vliet is probably out of there. And again, then you also look at Scotty Barnes, right? He can handle some, he can do some playmaking.
yes.
Out there, right? We know Siakam obviously can also play make. So you don't have to have like a normal table setting guard, but you definitely need, I think, a little bit more size and defense at that spot. And I think he can get that done for you. But
Sure.
again, like you said, there's a lot of great options here.
Yeah. Um, and for pick number 14, I'm having New Orleans. They have this pick that could be up in the air. We'll see. But I have them picking Jalen Hood, Scafino, and he's really good. I feel like this is kind of something that the NBA is shifting to in terms of the draft. They're looking for combo guard creators, and I think he flashed enough. On both ends at Indiana, definitely to push. For this potential lottery pick. This is the last lottery pick. He's frame. Excuse me. He's really good defensively, and he really knows how to attack and definitely make plays on the fly. I guess. I feel like you said, his shot needs to become more developed. Developed. It needs to be more consistent. But the tools are definitely there, and I think um, the building blocks and the starting prototype are definitely there. So with some refinery, I think he could be really good fit for New Orleans.
Yeah, I have Keontae George
Okay.
for New Orleans. Um, I feel like again, you have a combo guard, right? Because we know they have a decent amount of wings, right? They got
Sure.
Ingram, they got Zion, they got
Mm-hmm.
Troy Murphy, and then and again Herbert Jones Herb Jones, basically, right? Who's kind of like a mix between like a guard wing sort of. Um, so I feel like again, get a combo guard, right? Because you're set at the wings, right? You don't really need like a ton of more bigs because they have a lot of those guys. And again with McCollum, right, who's at a point, right, where he's a little bit older now, right? So we don't know long term, how his game will translate as he ages. He should still be good.
Yeah.
But with George, right, you just get another combo guard you can put out there, as a scorer. And again, like you said, New Orleans has options. Maybe they trade the pick. Maybe they keep it. But I'm again, like I said, with a lot of these other picks, I'm assuming they keep it. And so I feel like that's a pretty solid, guy to add in there. Just because, again, I've mentioned a lot of wings, because again, it feels like it sounds kind of repetitive, but I do like a lot of these
Yes.
teams adding them. But I just feel like New Orleans has so many, and at this point, there's a lot more guards, that are here that are probably better.
Mm-hmm.
So those are probably the guys that you might want to pick. So I feel like, that's the guy that you pick. Again, 6'4", so not too small. Um, right. It's not like he's 6'1". So I just feel like that's a pretty good guy to pick. And I feel like his stock or like where he goes could really change because I could
Yeah.
see him going like maybe somewhat higher, but I could also see him dropping a
I have
little
him
bit.
lower. And I'm
Yeah,
high on
exactly.
him. That's the thing. I love his game, but the problem is
Exactly.
I feel like he's a little bit more polarizing among,
Right.
this draft class. So I feel like he's probably gonna fall, but that's just me.
Exactly. Yeah. But again, I do think he has some upside as a scorer,
Mm-hmm.
and even as a defender. But like I said, I just feel like with New Orleans, that's the guy you got to get just as, sort of a combo guard type guy
Yes.
because they have a lot of playmakers. You don't have to have a traditional table setter. But at the same time, again, maybe there might be a guy who's better. But like I said, that's who I'm going with as the combo guard.
Yes. All right. So this is the lottery is officially done. So now we're moving into the 15th pick, and Atlanta has this one. This one was interesting for me because you had said that this guy was going earlier, but I have him going a little bit later, and that's just due to his raw talent, and we kind of don't. I don't think we know enough about him, but it's Bilal Koulibaly. He's good. I think he's good, but um he's a little rough around the edges for me. And playing with Wembenyama, I feel like he got some time to shine in the spotlight, I guess. But he does have great athleticism, and The shooting, it's not great, but I feel like there is room for improvements. That's kind of why I have him here. And I think, he's a good fit alongside Trey Young, DeJounte Murray. And I feel like, this is kind of DeAndre Hunter insurance, maybe, because that guy's he's something else. But yeah, I've got Bilal going here. I think that's a good replacement and somebody maybe to even push DeAndre Hunter to be even better.
Yeah. This is where I have Buffkin. I
Okay.
basically, like I said, swapped those two guys.
Right.
Because again, like you said, I like both of them.
Yeah.
Um, it's just again, like, I feel like either one, could be really solid. Like you said, I feel like with Buffkin, he probably has, more. He's probably the more likely guy to be ready.
Yeah.
So I feel like that could help out a team like Atlanta, right? Who probably, shouldn't be waiting, for guys because it seems like they're trying to compete, right? We know they got Trey Young, we know they got Dejounte Murray, Capella. We'll see what happens with John Collins. So I feel like they should probably get a guy who's a little bit more ready.
Hmm.
So I have Buffkin there. Like you said, Hunter, you know, up and down, right? Some nights he's really good, and then other nights he's, a little bit
Yeah.
rough.
That's why I
Um,
called him something else.
yeah, exactly, right? Buffkin's, younger, right? So again, even with that age, he's already coming in with some pretty solid skill sets. So I really like that for Atlanta.
Yeah.
Buffkin.
Yeah. I think that's good thinking. And then moving on to the 16th pick. This is Utah's pick via Minnesota. And this is an interesting pick because this is a guy I think that if he didn't get hurt, he would have been way higher on the board. And this is Derek Whitehead. You talked about it earlier. They do need some sort of wing, I think, in Utah. But the problem is I kind of have to go into his injury history. But first, to read out his stats, he averaged 8 points per game, 2 rebounds, 1 assist, but 42% from the 3 point line, which is pretty good. But the problem is, the injury history. So, I feel like he doesn't come without downsides. He had 2 surgeries last year on his split and played the entire season majority of the season at Duke, dealing with complications with that. But, I feel like he's a big swing for the Jazz. And I think that's something they need to do because they can afford to be patient. They're going through somewhat of a rebuild, I guess. But yeah, he was a former top 5 recruit. Definitely a star potential and he's really athletic, but big time scoring potential as well. But the problem is that injury history, and that's probably why he fell out of the lottery for me. But overall, I definitely think somebody needs to take a swing at him, and I think Utah is definitely the team to do that.
Right. Yeah, here this is where I have Grady Dick.
Okay.
For Utah with that 16th pick.
Hmm.
Because again, with the earlier pick, right, I got them taking Koulibaly with at the wing,
Hmm.
and then after that, I have them taking Dick, to have another guard out there,
Yes.
right, but
Yes.
a
Yes.
bigger guard, right, because you got Colin Sexton, obviously you got Markkinen, you have Kessler, right, but then after that, with that bigger guard spot, right, you have THT right now, who's kind of like a 2-3, right,
Hmm.
long term, probably not a starter. Right, Clarkson, right, he's there, right, but again, he's older, right, so he probably doesn't have like a long term future in Utah.
Yeah.
Um, so I got Dick out there, right, as a guy that's kind of like a skilled shooter who's can do a little bit of playmaking as well, right. So you can he's pretty solid at pull ups, and he can catch and shoot. So he's not just like a typical like just spot up guy, right, that can't really do much else. So that's where I have him going to Utah just to kind of round out that rotation.
Sure.
Because again, they need wings and they need bigger guards. So that's where I have him.
Okay. Um. And for the next pick, this is the Lakers. I kind of want you to take the lead on this one, just because you're the Laker fan. So I want to hear yours first.
Exactly. So for me, and again, this is another guy where I feel like maybe he might go higher.
Hmm.
I have Jet Howard,
Okay.
um, out of Michigan.
Okay.
Uh, again, I feel like with him, I feel like again, it wouldn't shock me if they took a guy like a Chris Murray or just some type of wing that that's a little bit more ready. But again, the Lakers are in this interesting spot where they're they were in the Western Conference Finals, with their two superstars LeBron and AD. Um, so it's kind of an interesting thing, right? So it wouldn't shock me if they traded the pick. But for me, again, like I said, I'm going into all these assuming they keep the pick. So
Right.
if I'm keeping the pick, I'm almost kind of like having somebody right who could potentially play right away, but also has some, has somebody who can kind of also probably grow over time because you have to factor in with LeBron and AD, it is a little bit of an older core, especially with LeBron. We don't know how many more seasons he has left,
Right.
so you kind of also have to look towards the future, right? Just having a guy, right, who can probably be there for a while. And again, if he pans out, maybe he can play, at points during the season. I'm assuming he probably won't, regardless of who they pick. Just because again, we don't normally see, rookies, that are picked in this lower first half of the or the lower half of the first round. We don't normally see those type of guys playing like big minutes on,
Sure.
like a championship type team.
Right.
So I'm kind of here like kind of looking for, a little bit more upside because he is young, right? He's, I don't think he's still 19, right? He hasn't turned 20 quite yet. Um, there's a lot of really solid Michigan players that have come into the league,
Yeah.
right? So we know he's going to compete, for the most part on both ends of the floor at a high level. So that's who I have. But again, like I said, it wouldn't shock me if they took somebody else, just because again they have a lot of options here.
Yeah.
But I do think they should probably go with the wing, just because again, just as sort of like a long term future pick, right? 'Cause if you're picking somebody who's who you want to play right now, maybe you want to guard because you already have some wings with Rui and Vanderbilt.
Sure.
And I feel like this lower half of the draft, right? These are more playoff teams, so
Yeah.
these are probably teams that are probably going to look more so at like who's the guy that's going to fit us the best,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to like automatically who's the most talented guy. So
Sure.
that's who I got here.
Yeah. For me, it's completely different. This might be the biggest miss. This might be a huge hot take, but with the Lakers, the 17th pick, I have them picking Jaime. I think that's how you say his name. Jaime
I know who. Yeah.
Jaquez Jr. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm terrible with Spanish, so forgive me if I butchered that. But yeah, he's 22. That's a big deal. He's 22. He's a senior. He played for UCLA. That's a big deal as well. Those guys are normally pretty good, and I feel like UCLA's championship, or not championship, but their tournament run was definitely one to watch this year. And he's been solid. I think, for all 4 years that he played, he battled through some pretty significant injuries, but he still played. Like, you didn't see a regression in his game. And I think that might be why the Lakers could potentially pick him here. And he averaged, almost 20 points on with 8 rebounds and 31% from three. So, he's pretty good. He's pretty savvy. I think he's very experienced, and that's something I think the Lakers want. I don't think they want a guy, that's young and doesn't know what they're doing. I think they want somebody who's pretty NBA ready. But like I said, the only issue is he's 22, so that's definitely why he's fallen here. But he can be a creator, scorer. Not at an elite level, but he can definitely embrace his role as a defensive playmaker as well. And definitely one of the tougher guys in the draft class. Don't be fooled by the way he looks. He has some grit to him, and I think that's what the Lakers might want to do. But that could be a hot take, so we'll see.
Yeah. So I guess, we're moving on into the 18th pick. This is the
Hmm.
Miami Heat.
Yep.
Again, another team where we don't know what they're necessarily going to
Right.
do, right? But we're assuming we're taking it. So this is where I have Leonard Miller. So he, fell a little bit for me.
Hmm.
6'9", right? 6'9" when you've already mentioned him
Yeah.
before.
Yeah.
When you look at that Miami team, I feel like they definitely could use a little bit more versatility, at
Sure.
that wing spot, right? You had Butler. Obviously, he was a terrific option at the wing. Right, but then after that, right, not much else, right? You had Duncan Robinson, kind of on the wings, right? But it doesn't really bring you a lot of versatility defensively. I feel like they need a little bit more athleticism, just a little bit more, juice, out there because it is a team that has, some older guys and some other guys that aren't quite that athletic. So I
Hmm.
feel like that would kind of add another dynamic, to also kind of mesh with, say, like a guy like Bam, right, who's a really good athlete, at that big spot. So that's kind of where I have him. Like you said, you already talked a lot about him, earlier in the draft, right? But again, I have him here going to the Miami Heat just because, again, I feel like, um, that's probably a guy they should take. But again, it'll be interesting because Miami, you know, uh, again, they've been able to kind of do this interesting thing where they've been able to take guys, right, who don't really seem like they would fit the profile of, a guy that would really do a whole lot.
Sure.
Um, so maybe they don't, maybe they pick, kind of like a guy who may be a little bit more raw, or maybe they pick a guy who's more ready. But like I said, I just have them picking him just because I think they need a little bit more size and athleticism at that wing spot. We saw them in the finals, right? They really struggled at times, trying to match Denver size, which is tough because Denver's a huge team, bigger than most teams, right? Probably the biggest in terms of the starting five, right?
Yeah.
in the NBA other than like Orlando, right? But Orlando's, in a different point because they're not like an elite team. Um, right, and they're not quite as skilled as Denver, right? But that's where I'm thinking what I'm thinking Miami should do. Just and again, get some more size, get some more athleticism, so that way you're not completely puny. Getting matched up against teams because again, I feel like there's gonna be some more teams with size, that will add more size in the offseason, whether or not it's through free agency or the
Yes.
draft. So if you're Miami again, load up on that size and athleticism right now, because that could probably help you out, down the road again. Because similar to LA, they're trying to compete and contend, right? They have some veteran guys, in Jimmy and Bam, amongst others, right? Because again, we just saw them in the finals and they went to the finals a few years ago. So they're as long as they have Butler there, they're gonna look to contend. So again, anything that can help you, right now, even though he probably won't help you too much, right? But again, he's got a lot of potential just as a guy that gives you length and athleticism, and I think that's what they need.
Yeah.
But again, it's going to be interesting to see what Miami does, at this pick because again,
Sure.
we mentioned before with a lot of these other guys, they have a ton of options.
Yeah. And for me, this is a guy that I'm kind of high on, but not really at the same time. There's a lot more questions than hype for me, and that's Jet Howard. I have him going to Miami. I know that's pretty low. I think everybody thinks he's kind of a lock for a lottery, but I'm not on that train yet.
I
Um,
didn't have him in the lottery either,
Okay,
so
yeah, yeah, but he's 6'8". You're kind of mentioning the size. I feel like that could potentially help Miami as well. But I have questions about everything about him except for his shooting. He's a knockdown shooter, 36% from the 3-point line. But I feel like that's an elite trait in today's NBA. So it's like that's something that does set him apart from other guys on this in this draft class where it's like, their shooting is a question, but his shooting isn't, but everything else kind of is. He averaged 14 points, 3 rebounds, 2 assists. And it's like, I don't know how he's going to fit in the NBA outside of his shooting. That's my only concern. But, he is a Michigan guy. He's definitely going to compete. Like you said, those guys are known winners. So I think, adding that to Miami will definitely help them for sure.
yeah. This one was kind of tough for me because again, we're going into 19, right? So this is the
Hmm.
Golden State Warriors.
Oh, yeah.
Um, right, and again, this is kind of an interesting spot, right? Because aside from, the couple of years, right, post KD where they, had all those injuries and they were bad, they're in this interesting spot, right, where they probably need some guys that can help them right now. But at the same time, right, that they probably don't have too many more years left of, high level contention,
Hmm.
where they're gonna, be a championship team. So this one is really, really tough because I think there's a number of guys um they can have here. But for right now, I have Derek Whitehead here, which again, it's just I don't know. This is kind of like a gamble pick because, like you said, he had some real issues in terms of his health, and his injuries. I do feel like the upside is potentially there if he can find a way to get healthy.
Hmm.
Because I think he looked before his injuries, he looked like a really, really solid player,
Top
and I feel
five.
like Golden State, it seems like they have a real history of kind of picking these guys, that like they were in high school and they were really, really high level prospects, right? And then, they come into college and then they
Yeah.
disappoint a little bit, so then they fall really low. So, and again, I feel like he's got some versatility, at
Yeah.
that wing spot. His athleticism looked like it took a step back coming back from that foot injury, but again,
Yes.
if he can get back, to that pre-injury, um, phase, right? I think that's somebody that could really help Golden State out. It again, a lot of it comes down to health because again, those foot injuries are really scary when you're an NBA team looking to draft guys, right? Because again, we've seen guys, drop significantly once they have that injury history. Because we saw Michael Porter Jr., years ago, right? He was looked at as, the best prospect in high school, right? The best guy in his high school
Yeah.
class. Right. And then he has the back issues, when he's in college, and then he drops, from a potential top 5 pick, he dropped all the way to the bottom of the lottery. Um, so I don't know. Like I said, I feel like this is again, this part from 18 to 30, 20 to 30,
Hmm.
I feel like it's going to differ for a lot of people just
Yes, it
because a
will.
lot of people have different feelings about each of these guys. But like I said, I feel like Golden State, it feels like they just have a history of taking these type of guys. So that's who I have there. If he can figure out the health stuff, I think he could really help them out.
Yes, sir. And for me, this might be a interesting another hot one. This is a guy I haven't really mentioned, but you definitely took him higher than I did, and that is Derek Lively. I think looking at my draft, my mock draft, I feel like he's the best available at this point. He's a solid rim protector. I feel like he was one of the more effective ones in college last season. He's got some growing to do as an offensive weapon, but I think his defensive prowess is definitely a foundational like piece of his game that will easily translate, to the to the NBA level. And I think, he'll present a real value to the Warriors because I feel like that's something that they could be potentially lacking. I know Looney's pretty good on the boards, but Draymond is pretty undersized, and there's some questions about what they potentially even do with Draymond. If he gets some money or a payday or something like that. But for me, I'm going Derek Lively here. I think he's rough around the edges on offense, but defensively he's definitely a rim protector.
All right, so with 20, I have Chris Murray as a wing. Again, I feel like with their earlier pick in the draft, right? We know with I had Thompson as a guard, right? So I felt like, they need a little more of a table setter guy. Um but with this pick, I have Chris Murray. Again, maybe it's a little bit redundant, because again, you already have, guys that are, kind of like the 4 threes,
Hmm.
with Jabari Smith, with Eason. But again, just another guy, right, that's got length, that's got shooting. He's a little bit older,
Yeah.
kind of like his brother. Well, I guess, yeah, they're twins basically. Right?
Yeah, they're
Yeah,
twins. Yeah.
exactly. So I mean, he's older, like his brother, Keegan Murray, who plays for the Kings. But again, with if you're Houston, again, I feel like you kind of ideally also just want to put some other guys in there, right, who are ready, to contribute right now, because we know it was kind of rough for Houston last year, in terms of they had some guys, who were really solid, and then other guys who were just incredibly raw. So just having another, high IQ guy, you know, um, who again, is pretty versatile and as kind of like a 3-and-D guy, like his brother, right? I think that would really help Houston, to kind of like just set something going forward. Because again, like they need defense, they need shooting, they need some length and to go along with that athleticism because they already have the athleticism, but and they have some skill in some certain areas, but it's not refined.
Right.
Because again, like I said, a lot of one-on-one guys, and guys that just again don't always make great decisions. So just having another guy out there, like I said, that can kind of, like you said, be a connector, like you said earlier. I think that could really help, and that's who I have here with Houston. But again, he's a guy that I feel like some people have higher, some people have lower,
Yeah.
but that's who I have right there.
Yeah. For me, it's a little bit different. I have Keontae George, and you were talking about their scoring and ISO ball guys, and he's kind of one of those guys, which is kind of funny enough. But for me, I think this is more of insurance on some guys. Maybe some Kevin Porter Jr. insurance, maybe somebody to push Josh Christopher. But in my opinion, I feel like Keontae George, he kind of reminds me of a little bit of shades of Beal, I guess, in terms of score, score, score. That's kind of it. And I feel like he kind of chose the wrong school, but he is out of Baylor. You kind of mentioned it earlier, but he had a really good draft combine, and I feel like he probably would have gone lower if he didn't have a good draft combine. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about here, and I think that's honestly a fit. And it could honestly even be some Amon Thompson insurance as well. Say Amon Thompson doesn't work out, maybe Keontae George turns out to be a little bit better. You never know. But that's kind of the way that's the mindset that I'm using for this Houston pick. And, it's via the Clippers, but it's just hard to talk about some of these lower picks because, like you said, they're more fit wise, but Houston is such a bad team. It's like, what can you really do here?
Right, exactly. Yeah. So moving on to the 21st pick. This is kind of an interesting spot, right? Because
Hmm.
it's the same team. They have back-to-back picks at
Yes.
21 and 22. It's Brooklyn, right? So the first one, 21, is actually Phoenix's pick.
Hmm.
Right, but we know with Phoenix who traded all those picks in that Durant trade.
Yep.
Obviously, now they're kind of at this interesting crossroads point now where they're kind of like in that weird spot where they're, they had those guys like Bridges, right? But they're also, I think, in kind of sort of like a semi rebuild mode.
Hmm.
So with them, I have Jordan Hawkins. So I think you already have Bridges, right? You got Cam Johnson, who's a young guy, hopefully Brooklyn brings him back, right? Because he's still a guy that should be able to play there for a while. Um, so you have a decent amount of wing options there, right? You got Claxton as your big. So I feel like this is where you probably kind of need to lean into your, guard rotation, your
Yeah.
guard back a little bit more. Just again, with Brooklyn, one of the issues I felt like they had in the playoffs, right, it just seemed like they didn't really have like a guy on the perimeter, as a creator, right? Like, you had Bridges, but he's more out on the wings, right? He's not doing the same type of creation stuff, as usually that guards would do. Just having a guy right, just so again, he had some issues in terms of injuries at UConn, but I just think in terms of what he can bring, at that guard spot as a scorer, that I think would probably help Brooklyn a little bit. Just in terms of again, you need a guy that can handle the ball, especially late in games, right? Because again, Bridges was fine, right? But
Yeah.
you need a little bit more ball handling, and wings, their wings, that's not what most of those guys really do aside from Bridges, right? Because Dorian Finney-Smith isn't really much of a ball handler,
No.
right? Cam Johnson, not really much of a ball handler, right? More of a spot up guy. So just in terms of again getting another perimeter ball handler that can help you create, especially late in games, I think that's probably a guy that could really help you out there. And again, Brooklyn's in an interesting spot, right? Because they don't have some of their picks they don't have,
Sure.
right, with that James Harden trade. So they're kind of in this weird spot where they can't really tank and be just flat out awful. Because again, some of their picks will be going to Houston. Um, so it's going to be interesting to see what Brooklyn does because they have a decent amount of flexibility here. But again, knowing that you're probably not going to be a great team, right? Get some of these younger guys, get another guard out there that can help you out with your offense, and again, that's what I would do.
Yeah. For me, like you said, these are back-to-back picks. So my second one is kind of more on that mindset, but I have Brooklyn taking Chris Murray here. That's the twin. You talked about him a lot. I feel like he had a pretty breakout season for Iowa. He averaged 20 points per game, also showing off that insane range from three. Combo forward who brings versatility, polish, and pretty much some size. And I think, that's something that I feel like, Brooklyn already has, but they definitely have potential to build on it. That's kind of what I'm thinking in terms of my mindset there. And, like I said, my 22nd pick is a little bit more along the lines of what you were thinking.
Exactly. So I guess moving on, right. So again, another scenario where, like we mentioned before, right, Brooklyn still has the 22nd pick.
Mhm.
Here, I have a guy, that I feel like has kind of, sort of, his name has sort of made the rounds a little bit more lately, right? So I have Nick Smith Jr.,
Okay.
right? So again, it's another guard, but more like a combo guard, right? Point guard, shooting guard.
Mhm.
Played for Arkansas. I feel like again, kind of just similar to what I mentioned with Hawkins. Just another guy, right? Just another combo guard with good size, decent wingspan, um, pretty good athlete. I just feel like for them, they need to kind of shore up that guard rotation because I feel like they're
Sure.
already set at their wings. So again, just keep getting these combo guards, right? These athletic guys that can make some plays. And again, he should be also decent defensively, right? With his wingspan, with his athleticism. And with Brooklyn, they need to kind of also look at that as well. Right. That's kind of one of the issues with Cam Thomas, right? Where he's a pretty solid scorer,
Yeah.
but his minutes are just so up and down, right? Because that's pretty much all he does. So again, with Nick Smith, right? If he can get that defensive upside going, right, that's a pretty solid guy you got because that's a guy that is a pretty versatile scorer, right? Decent shooter, mid range, pretty athletic, but also has long arms and is a really good athlete. So if he can figure out the two-way aspect of his game, that's somebody that I think could really help out Brooklyn
Sure.
from that guard spot because I feel like that's what they need because they're set
Yes.
on the wings. And bigs, again, I feel like with Claxton, you're there. You could probably use another big, but again, you can get that in the later part
Sure.
of the draft. I
Yeah,
think.
I agree with that. And I have similar mindset, not the same guy though. This is probably one of my more favorited guys in this draft class, and that's Colby Jones. I have Brooklyn taking him. He's kind of like a microwave. He can fade in and out of the games, and you look away for 1 second, look back, and he has 10 points. But at the same time, with those 10 points, he's probably going to give you 7 assists and 8 rebounds. I feel like he just impacts winning on a variety of ways, and I feel like that could be something that Brooklyn's looking for, especially around their roster. It's a young core of guys. Um, and guys that have potential and flashes. We saw Bridges kind of take that next step. So hopefully they can kind of pull that out of Colby Jones as well. I think he's one of the better guards in this draft class.
Um, so going to Portland at number 23. Again, Portland's, an interesting case where like, maybe they trade the pick, maybe they don't.
Hmm.
So I have them taking a big man. So I got Mr. James Najee,
Okay.
right? So for me, part of it is that again, you look at Nurkic, right? And he was pretty solid initially when he came to Portland, but it seems like he's had some real issues with injuries. He broke his leg right a few years ago, and it seems like just since that point, he just hasn't been the same, unfortunately. Um, right. So obviously, when I had them taking the other guy third, right,
Yeah.
with Miller. Um, now I'm looking at the big man spot. So like I said, I just think again, pretty good athlete. Got a lot of length and size to him, right? 7 feet, 250, so pretty big dude. Very young, right? Still 18, I think, as of right now.
Yes.
Um, right from Nigeria. So I feel like again, it's another one of these interesting picks where it's like, he's raw, right? Because again, he's more like a traditional interior big, but he's also a really good athlete, long arms. And I just feel like again, if you're Portland, you probably need to shore up that big rotation, right? Because they had, again, if you watch them, they had a number of guys kind of playing out of position, especially when Nurkic was out, right? They had Trendon Watford at center at times, who's not really a center, right? He's more like a wing forward. Um, you also saw, other guys, Drew Eubanks, who again is fine, right? But again, a little bit small. So again, getting a bigger guy with some more size and some athleticism, I feel like that could kind of again juice up Portland because they already have a number of really good athletes. And again, they have other guys that can shoot. So you don't necessarily have to have a stretch five out there, right? Again, with
Right.
Lillard, with Miller, with Simons, you have a lot of guys that can create and shoot. So again, you need a guy that can kind of just be a cleanup guy, around the rim, block shots, get rebounds, and I feel like that's kind of a guy that would really help them out.
Okay. I have Bryce Sensabaugh. He's pretty good. He wasn't even really on that one and done radar entering this season, but his production at Ohio State, um, it's really hard to ignore in my opinion. He uses his big frame well, smashes roll as a rotation piece. He hit like I think 40. I think it was around four. Yeah, let me check. 40% from three, so that's pretty good. And that's a rotational guy. Um, and yeah, I mean, the knockdown shooting's there. I think that's something that Portland could build on. You kind of were talking about size and stuff like that, but I'm leaning more towards, we need some offense in Portland, in my opinion. Just some help. This is help. I think this is the ideal guy for help for Dame, in my opinion, if they keep Dame, that is. But yeah, I feel like this is a guy who kind of flew under the radar, and I feel like he has potential to make some waves.
Yeah,
Um, and I guess to move on to the 24th pick, this is an interesting one for me. This is a guy who's definitely high on my list, but I have to be realistic. I think he should go definitely a lot higher, and that's Jordan Hawkins. I think Sacramento is definitely going to pick Jordan Hawkins here if he's still on the board. I feel like he's really skilled spot up shooter for sure. He hits a lot of contested threes, and I feel like that's like kind of the center of his offensive hub, and his space creation is definitely underrated, underappreciated on a different level. And he kind of reminds me of like Duncan Robinson kind of esque levels of 3-point shooting, but with, a bag. In my opinion, I don't think Duncan Robinson has, the best shot creating ability. And I think Jordan Hawkins adds that, and that could be definitely lethal. And I think, that could definitely be a rotational piece that Sacramento could use to make another playoff run.
okay. So with the 24th pick of the NBA draft, I have Noah Clowney
Okay.
um, going to the Sacramento Kings. Again, I feel like with them, we saw what they were able to do, last season. Obviously, it was kind of in, like you said with Miami, sort of like a Cinderella-ish story, right, where they were, a team that not as many people expected to be as good as they were.
Hmm.
Um, but again, we saw with them, it's just kind of interesting. With them, I feel like one of the issues for them was I think that they definitely obviously needed some defensive versatility.
Yeah.
Now with them, it's more so potential. I think because he's 6'10, 210, right? So relatively thin. So I think with him, I feel like if he can kind of develop, that sort of a two-way potential, That's a guy that I think could really help them out on the defensive end with the length and the athleticism. Um, and again, he can kind of rim run. He's got a. It's kind of interesting where he's got a decent looking jump shot, but it's one of those shots where it's not consistent yet. So I think he's a little bit raw.
Hmm.
But again, in Sacramento, when you can play out on the open floor, right? So you don't necessarily have to have all those things ready right out of the gates just yet.
Hmm.
But if he can grow that shot and if he can continue that defensive versatility, I think that could really help out Sacramento because they need length in defense. Because I feel like that really hurt them in the playoffs last year, right? Where if they just had one extra guy, that could defend at a decent level, and do something a little bit more than just shoot threes, right? Maybe they beat Golden State. Um, so they're in an interesting spot now, where again they're good, right? But again, you could always add a little bit more size and length just to be a little bit better, at both ends of the floor. So that's why I have. But I feel like he's kind of like one of those real gamble picks. Where again, if he doesn't work out, it's gonna be really weird.
Yeah, I get that. Moving on to the 25th pick. This is Memphis. This is an interesting pick because, they're one of those teams where, they had the second seed this year, but kind of flamed out in the playoffs. But nonetheless, I think they do need to build. And, with Dylan Brooks potentially on the way out, I think they need to get, maybe a shooting guard. And I'm picking Brandon Podziemski. I think I just butchered his name, but he's really good. He averaged 20 points, 8 rebounds, 3 assists, and he shot 43% from the three. Those numbers are kind of interesting, though. You kind of have to take those with a grain of salt sometimes, especially, considering he played at Santa Clara. But, he is a more plug and play combo guard who I think can add scoring, playmaking, toughness right away. And he won COWCC Player of the Year honors at Santa Clara. So, he's pretty good. He's a sophomore. Um, but I feel like after the combine, I feel like he kind of got put on the radar. But nonetheless, I think he's really, really good, and I think Memphis will probably pick him up. Just to add some shooting because I think that's something that they struggled with in the playoffs.
Yeah. So I actually have Bryce Sensabaugh here.
Okay,
Maybe he probably goes a little bit higher, but
I think
I
so.
feel
Yeah.
like it's kind of for similar reasons as what you said, right? Whereas with Memphis, we know they already have a really high level defense.
Hmm.
They were one of the top defensive teams in the league last year, but where they've really struggled is on the offensive end, especially with 3-point shooting.
Yep.
He's a scorer. He's a really good outside shooter. Obviously, you mentioned a lot of his strengths. So I feel like for Memphis, they need a guy, right, that can space the floor, that can
Yes.
hit some of those jump shots, right? Because again, that's their main weakness, as a team, is that
Hmm.
just that lack of shooting, the inconsistent offensive games, right? Because that really hurt them, especially late in games, because you just don't know, what you're getting on the offensive end of the floor. And like when the offense, kind of just bogs down, it's really rough for Memphis. Because again, it doesn't matter how great your defense is, if you can't score late in games, it's really tough, on both
Yes.
ends of the floor. So I think that they need some more scoring out there. So that's kind of what I have, with Bryce Sensabaugh going there. But I could see him potentially going higher because I do know a lot of people like him.
Yeah. And then moving on to the 26th pick, I'm kind of going to be a little bit quicker here because, it's Indiana. I feel like, with the 26th pick, what can they really do here? But, I'm probably going to go Olivier Maxence Prosper. He's pretty good. He went to Marquette, sophomore, but, he averaged around 12.5 points per game, 5 rebounds. Not a playmaker at all, point 0.7 assists, 33% from the three. Interesting numbers, but, he played really well in the combine. I think, at this point, you kind of have to take the combine into extreme consideration. And then, he showed some pretty good energy, being a combo forward that, probably solidified himself, I think, in this top 30. He's really athletic, long forward, who can really shoot and impact, and I think he has that winning effort, not necessarily, the winning experience, but definitely the winning effort. And I think that's something that Indiana definitely needs. And, just in terms of size, he's 6'7", so that definitely helps them as well.
Yeah, so here, this is where I have Podziemski going.
Okay.
So like basically one pick
Yeah,
after you. Again, kind of a similar thing with Indiana, right? We're at that other guard spot. Just another guy who can be kind of like a scorer.
sure.
Um, again, he had a really high level of improvement in his second year, although a lot of that was also more playing time. But he did get much better, right? Especially as a shooter.
Mhm.
That's something that a lot of teams can always use. Indiana, you can use more of that. Um, for sure. Again, you kind of already went into his strengths. So again, for me, it's kind of like take what you thought of him from Memphis and just apply him over to Indiana,
Sure.
right? Just again as another guard, just as another scorer, that can really space the floor and shoot the ball. So that's kind of where I
Okay. Yeah, I agree. And then moving into the 27th pick, this is Charlotte. I'm sure they're gonna mess this up, but if I were them, I would probably pick Nick Smith Jr. I know you had him way higher than I did. But my thing is, the injury history, it's really rough. He had a nagging knee injury that pretty much cost him, the ability to expose, the ability to have exposure, to showcase himself, on a huge stage this season. But, I feel like he was a potential top three pick. But, nonetheless, injury stuff does happen. And he was the number one recruit from the 2022 class, but he's super talented. You kind of went into it. Scorer, slasher. The 3-point shooting is a little bit rough, but, I think this is something or some guy that I think teams will be glad to bring in and develop, considering, he has in this range, you kind of have to pick guys like this. That's kind of where we are in the draft, honestly. We're 3 picks away from, being done with this, but, I feel like this is kind of his floor, but I don't really see him falling into the second round. That's kind of why I put him up here.
This is where I have Jaime Jaquez Jr. Going to
Okay.
Charlotte with this pick. Again, like you mentioned earlier with him, he's got a lot of versatile skill sets. He's older, right? But also in terms of his maturity, his competitiveness,
Hmm.
and just again, he seems like he might be, kind of ready to help you right
Yeah.
away. I just feel like Charlotte could probably use one of those guys. And again, like you said, especially this late into the first round, you know, this is probably where where you could probably be okay with picking, these guys that are already ready.
Right.
You can kind of gamble in the earlier parts of the first round, right? Because that's where you're kind of looking for the big ceiling guys. But again, with Charlotte, you got to figure out, somebody that can be on the floor and play. Because again, they've had a real problem, with those type of guys the last, several seasons. Which it's kind of in a way sort of just like you said, dictated Jordan's run in Charlotte, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But um, so I feel like again, like you said, shooting, competitiveness, defense, not super athletic, but again, I just feel like he's a guy who can help you right away, and you need that with Charlotte, right? You
Yes, you
need
do.
somebody who's mature, who's got a high basketball IQ, who's got a really good feel for the game, that can help you out in a number of ways. They don't have a ton of that in Charlotte, and that's a problem, right? Because again, that's the big issue with them was they have a lot of guys who have in theory decent ceilings, but they just haven't panned out. But get a
Yeah.
guy that can help you right away with this pick, because you need more talent because Charlotte just does not have a lot of that. And getting one of these ready guys, because again we've seen these type of guys in previous drafts, right? We know Kyle Kuzma, was a late first round pick.
Yes.
Josh Hart, right? That's a guy that was a late first round pick, and these guys came into the league and they were already, kind of ready, with defined skill sets. And again, if you can get those type of guys, if you're Charlotte, that could really help you out, and that can kind of, put you on the path to being a more competitive team. So I feel like that's where he would really help you.
Yeah. And then moving on to pick number 28. This is an interesting one because this is Utah again. They got this pick from, I think, Philly. And, I feel like Utah is going to take some big swings, and this is another big swing. This is more of a gamble, but I have them picking Ryan Rupert. He's from France. He's 6'6, 192. He's really developmental. He's definitely in that developmental stage, and he probably will be for a little bit, but he definitely has real skill and definitely a defensive, mindset as well. He played for the NBL, New Zealand Breakers, I think. He has like long-term intriguing like talent, and I feel like that's something you kind of have to gamble on in this range. And if you're Utah, you definitely should be gambling for sure. Huge movement skills, it's kind of like when you look at him, you kind of think like, does this guy do ballet for balance or something? He flashes like huge upside as a creator and definitely can get downhill pretty quickly. And I feel like those are tools that you kind of like in this range because we're at number 28. This is kind of where not the talent discrepancy show, but these are guys that aren't like super likely to be stars, but they will help you for sure, especially in that rotational area.
This is where I have Olivier Maxence Prosper.
Okay.
Again, like you said, Utah, they're kind of in this interesting spot where, like you said, you feel like they're gonna, pick guys, that have kind of these interesting physical aspects, right? Because again, he's 6'7" without shoes. Got a massive wingspan at 7'1". So he's a decent athlete, right? He's a good athlete.
Yeah,
Pretty fluid. Like you said, more of a defensive kind of guy, but he's got some offensive upside. But again, like you said, I just feel like with Utah, they're gonna take a lot of these interesting types of swings. That's kind of why I had Koulibaly, Grady Dick, guys like that. Where people are kind of like polarized on those picks. So that's kind of where I have him. Obviously, again, he's not he's not like a quick twitch type of guy. He's not that
sure.
quick, right? He's a good athlete. He's just
Yeah.
not that quick. And again, he doesn't create. He's more like a, maybe like a one dribble pull up type guy, but he's not a guy, right, that can, really create his own offense. Again, not a super great outside shooter.
Hmm.
Definitely fixable. I don't think it's like a broken type of,
Yeah.
shot, but again, just if he can kind of improve in like a lot of the little things,
Right.
right, he can probably be like a really, really solid rotational guy. But again, with Utah, it'll be interesting because it feels like they've kind of, we've seen them in previous drafts, right? Like Udoka Azubuike. Um, what's that other guy? I can't remember his name, but he was a guard. I think was it Jared Maxwell, I
I
think.
think so. Yeah.
Right. So they've kind of taken these weird swings.
Dante
On
Exum.
guys yeah, Dante Exum, right? So they've taken weird swings, haven't always panned out.
Yeah.
Speaking of names you mentioned, but again, this is kind of I think where you kind of need to get creative in the draft because, like you said, there's a lot of interesting options here. But again, Utah's in a weird spot where they're in a rebuild, but they have some decent talent at the top. But still, right? This is where I have him going. But I feel like again, he could bounce around maybe a little bit higher, maybe a little bit lower, and that's kind of the tough part, with this draft, especially as you get to the bottom of the first
Yes.
round.
And speaking of a guy that can't shoot for anything, we've got the 29th pick. And this guy is very interesting. He's a system guy. I feel like he's more of a second rounder, but I have to put him in the first round just because, if you look at the second round guys or potential second round guys, it's kind of scarce. But we'll get into that in a second. But this guy, his name is Trace Jackson Davis. He's a power forward, but he doesn't shoot threes. When I tell you he doesn't shoot threes, he doesn't shoot threes. He's pretty much a pure slasher. If you ever played 2K, he has a 0 3-point rating, 25, whatever you want to call it. And I feel like big men who don't shoot 3-pointers, they don't really pop off the page, as a definite first rounder, but I feel like there's a lot of potential because he's somewhat of an anomaly. He's a dominant interior scorer. He averaged 20 points per game, basically not shooting threes. So that kind of takes some skill, and he also averaged around 11 rebounds per game as well. He has a great touch. And he's a pretty good passer, He averaged four assists, and he played at Indiana, FYI. But people aren't too high on him. But the NBA circle, they're kind of optimistic about him, and I feel like this is a gamble that Indiana could definitely take. And I'm not sure, that he's going to develop into a floor spacer. That might be an issue, but just to have a guy that can be a guaranteed bucket in the paint, I feel like is something that Indiana could use for sure. They're definitely going to build through this draft.
Yeah. The funny thing is,
What's
I
up?
have him going to Indiana as
Okay,
well.
yeah, same mindset.
Like you said, he is an undersized big man,
Yes,
especially he played mostly center for Indiana.
yeah,
Right, 6'8", 240, 6'8" centers, you usually don't see too many of those in the NBA, aside from like, again, we've seen Draymond, but he's not even 6'8",
yeah,
he's 6'6". But just in general, like you said, he's got some interesting strengths. Um, Not a shooter at all,
yeah.
like you
He's
said.
not.
Um, but at the same time, um, offensively, like you said, around the basket, he's terrific. Great in the pick and roll.
Yes,
Like you said, really good passer. Has some interesting skill, in the post around the basket as well. It's not like he's just like just like a run to the rim and just throw
yeah.
the ball.
No. He has touch. He has touch. He has touch.
Exactly. He's got great touch. He's got a
Yeah.
great field skill. As a passer. And I think, like you said, that's kind of an interesting, a skill set for a big, especially undersized. Again, if he can work on that jump shot.
Yeah, the
Um,
jump shot is bad because he literally shot 0%. I'm
yeah,
sorry, I'm just laughing because the 0 is literally my face. But he's a
yeah,
great player. Obviously averaged 20 points and 10 rebounds on no 3-pointers. So that's
yeah,
that's a
exactly.
skill in itself.
Yeah. So great post score, which we don't have a ton of those at the NBA level. We
Right.
have some solid ones, right? But it's just kind of interesting because I do feel like there is a team that will, take a gamble on him. Obviously, the other thing with him is, uh, obviously the other thing with him is he is a 4-year guy, much older.
Yes, I didn't
Than a
mention
number of
that.
other guys in the draft. He's 23.
Yeah.
Indiana's got a little bit of experience with this, right? They took Chris Duarte a
Hmm.
few years ago, and he's also a relatively old guy for a rookie. I think
Yeah.
he came to the league at what 24.
Yeah.
Um, so they have experience taking these type of guys. So I really do like his game. Again, like you said, super efficient around the basket, just can't shoot a lick. So
Yeah, it's pretty rough.
yeah, exactly. So if he can even be like a barely average shooter, right? I think that raises his
It
ceiling
helps.
significantly. I just do kind of wonder where he fits because again, offensively he's definitely a 5. But just that 6'8", again, how many guys are gonna, can you really put guys alongside of him that are bigger? But again, we saw Miles Turner, right? He's more of a center, but he's also more of a stretch guy, as a center. So if you can get, kind of like a stretch big around him, that would be kind of an interesting fit. I just think he is a gamble because but he does come in with a, defined skill set. It's just a matter of can he continue to add on to it? Because again, the shooting is
Yeah, it's pretty abysmal. Um, and I guess moving into the last pick, we've come into the last pick of the first round. We're not going to cover the second round. We're just gonna kind of toss out names that we think teams should look out for. Um, and for this one, it's the Clippers. This is via the Bucks. Um, and this is an interesting guy because if you know high school basketball, you definitely know this guy for sure. And I have the Clippers picking Gregory Jackson. He's a power forward, huge athleticism. I think, the shooting isn't all that great. It's 32%, but definitely more athletic and mid range is there as well. But, he's a former number one recruit. Kind of had a disappointing season at South Carolina, honestly. But, he's going to be a one and done. And I think that's interesting. And I think he's the youngest prospect in the class as well. Um, but people around the league, they think he could sneak into the first round despite an underwhelming pre-draft process, and I think they're kind of just going off of the hype from high school, which is dangerous, but also has paid off in the past. But I'm curious to see where he goes. But I have him at 30. I think it would be kind of a crime to have him outside of the first round.
yeah. It's kind of interesting. Because again, you mentioned like you said at this point in the draft, um, there's a lot of those type of guys. I have him as well.
Okay.
Again,
Cool. Cool. Cool.
because again, like you said, he had a rough season for South Carolina, right? Really struggled in terms of
Yes.
efficiency. I do think he has an interesting skill set. As a guy who can, who's got a decent level of kind of creation to his game. And again, the jumper, again, it's a jumper that looks good. Right? Good elevation, solid release. It's just, again, it needs to get better. Like you said, 6'8", 215. He's super young. Like you said, I think he is the youngest guy in the draft. I think
Yes, he is.
he's 18. And I don't think he turns 19 until like midway through
Yeah,
December.
he's
So
pretty much a kid.
he's got a ton of room to grow.
Yes.
With the Clippers, they have a number of guys, that are veteran guys on the roster. So I don't feel like they're gonna be like overly inclined to pick somebody who's already ready to play.
Right.
So I again with Kawhi and Paul George's long term future as Clippers, maybe potentially up in the air just because again their age and their injury history. Why not get a super young guy, and see what you can do with him in terms of development, right? Because again, like you said, at this point, there's a number of guys that have interesting skill sets, but they're also projects. So again, if you're the Clippers, take that gamble, and kind of see what you can do because he's got some intriguing skill sets. Like I said, as a creator, he's got size, he's got length. Not a super athlete, right?
Right.
Obviously, by any means, but again, he's got some skill as a creator. And the Clippers do have that, but like I said, I'm kind of looking towards the future. Because again, I'm assuming that whoever they draft at 30 probably isn't going to play a whole lot. Especially during the regular season. So get him in the G League, have him develop. Because again, with a lot of these late first round picks, that's probably where most of these guys are going to play. Right? They're
Yeah.
probably going to spend a decent amount of time in the G League unless they're really ready to come play right now. Um, and with these gamble guys, like I said, he's so young. That's probably where he's going to be. But if he
Exactly.
pans out right, I think he does have some really interesting skill sets. From that creation standpoint. Because again, it's an interesting game.
Yeah.
It's again, like you said, it was a rough season. Really struggled as an efficient guy. But I think it is workable in terms of him getting better, from that efficiency standpoint. Again, take some interesting shots. Kind of like you mentioned with 2K before, as with the other guys, a pure slasher, he's definitely a shot creating type
Yes,
guy. Um, so again, he can get his own shot. He's got good footwork. It's just again, can he continue the other aspects of his game? And if he can
yeah,
do that, he could be a really intriguing player, I think. And
yeah,
again, he's super young, and you don't usually see, like an 18-year-old have that type of skill set. As a creator,
exactly.
they may have other, that may be more fleshed out. Maybe
Yes,
they come in already as a decent shooter, or as a really good athlete, or as a decent defender, right? But you don't normally see guys who can create offense already come in, already have that at a really young age. So
exactly.
he can add them, like I said, if he can become more versatile as a defensive guy, as a more efficient shooter, he could be a really solid player, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And that's pretty much our mock draft. We're only gonna do round one because of time. We're already pretty much at 2.5 hours, which is crazy. Um, but moving on, I guess we kind of have to look at the second round. We're gonna throw out a couple of guys that we think could be difference makers, sleepers, hidden gems. And I guess I'll go first. My first one. This is a guy who's really, honestly, in my top 20, of players in this entire draft class, but I just don't think he's going to go very high, just due to the fact that he got injured. And some people said he had an underwhelming season battling injuries, but that is Amari Bailey. I feel like he's somebody who's um, definitely NBA ready. He had a great pre draft process. If you're not familiar with him, he played at UCLA. He's a freshman. Um, 6'3", 191. Some people list him as a two guard. Some people list him as a point guard, but he's really solid, I think. He had a really good draft combine. He really flourished there, showed off his playmaking, scoring, facilitating, and I feel like there's so much untapped potential here. He's kind of like a more athletic D'Lo, I guess. I think that's the best comparison I can give. He's actually going to dunk it. D'Lo's just going to lay it up. But yeah, I think this guy is definitely solid for sure. He played at Sierra Canyon High School as well. So if you follow high school basketball, you know who the heck this is. I don't really have to say too much. He did shoot 38% from the three as well. So he's a sleeper. And I feel like, a team, because, once you get into the second rounders, I feel like there's also some teams that, have gotten some picks, but are also still in contention. Like I could definitely see Denver picking Amari Bailey up. That would be amazing. Um, but yeah, that's kind of what you get. I don't think he's going to be, late round two. I think he's probably going to go pretty early, probably around that 37th. Like I said, Denver. But yeah, that's one of my guys. And then another guy I have. Once again, if you follow high school basketball, you know who the heck this is. He's honestly regarded as one of the better prospects in all of basketball all time, really, in high school, and that's Amani Bates. He spent 2 seasons in college, which is interesting. He's a sophomore, but they were kind of rocky. Memphis was really bad for him. He did not look even college ready, if you want me to be honest. And then most recently, he was obviously at Eastern Michigan, which is, I think he's from that area as well. But he kind of struggled, scoring efficiently, but his bag is insane. He's 6'8". People have compared him to Kevin Durant. It's kind of crazy, the hype around this guy. But I feel like he could fit into a winning system. But I feel like also he has potential to go kind of high, but also low due to the fact that he's had multiple off the court issues. But I'm not going to factor that in too much. But I feel like there's a lot of interest in a player of his pedigree, given how much of a natural scorer he is, especially at that wing size. And
Yeah.
that's kind of all that I really have for the standouts from the second round guys.
Yeah. One name I had, again, another one of these guys that could be a potential, long-term prospect,
Hmm.
Jordan Walsh,
Okay.
from Arkansas. He's got a ridiculous frame, 6'6", 215, but he's got an over 7-foot wingspan at
Yeah.
6'6", which, again, that's incredible. Standing reach, almost 9 feet, which again, ridiculous. Um, Terrific athlete, pretty quick. Most of his upside, I think, is mainly defensively. He can kind of not only can he guard one on one, I feel like because of his length, um, and it seems like in terms of his understanding, it seems like team defense. I think he could also, be
Yeah.
pretty solid in terms of being able to switch, being
Yeah.
able to call out, different defensive schemes, being able to close out and rotate. So that's where I think most of his upside is. I think for him, like I said, with a lot of these other types of guys, the swing is Can he get that jump shot down?
Yeah, it's
Um,
really bad.
exactly. Yeah, I think he shot like 28%
Yeah,
from three in
it's
college.
it's pretty bad, and he
Yeah.
thinks he can
So
shoot.
yeah,
But
exactly. And again, he's I guess confident in taking those shots, right?
yeah,
He's not necessarily like passing up shots. So at the very least, the confidence is there. So that can probably help if you can continue to develop it. But again, you got to work on that shot. But I just think with the athletic upside and I think with the defensive IQ, I think at the very least, even if he's not like a great outside shooter, he should still be able to help you.
yeah,
But if he can hit that jump shot, he can be a really solid, I think, role player for a team.
yes,
That's kind of what we're looking at with a lot of these second round guys. Is probably more so role players because, like you said, the Nikola Jokic's, the Draymond Greens, that you can find in the second round of the draft. Those are usually not the type of players you're expecting, right?
right,
Even like a guy like a Manu Ginobili, right? He was, I think, second to last pick in the draft. Right. And again, you're just not usually looking, you don't normally get those type of guys in the second round. If you can get them, that's great. But that's usually not what you're necessarily looking for. You're not expecting to get a superstar or, an all-star guy out of the second round. You're expecting usually to get a guy who probably is a little bit maybe more ready than like a
yeah,
late first round pick, but it's not quite as bad of a gamble because if it doesn't pan out, it doesn't hurt you as much as a second round pick. Um, but again, I just think for him the athletic upside is there. And again, that's kind of, for me, that's my pick. A couple other, one other guy, maybe, Amari Moore,
okay,
San Jose State, right?
yeah,
Kind of like guard wing hybrid sort of, right? 6'5". Played 4 years of college, right? So he's a little bit older.
mm-hmm. He's
Right. But
toolsy though.
exactly, yeah. He improved, for the most part every season. His 3-point, percentage and his percentages as a whole took a dip in his last season. Right, as his I guess usage went up. So that's kind of a concern, right? If he can kind of get back to, his third season where he was shooting, over 40% from three and almost 50 from the field. That's a really solid player, I think, to have as a creator,
Hmm.
that can play multiple positions. Because again,
Yes.
he's also got long arms, 6'10" wingspan, huge hands. It's just again, the issue is, again, kind of a twig guy, so that's obviously a concern,
Yeah,
at
it's rough.
6'5". Yeah, exactly. Um, so he's got to get stronger, kind of like what we mentioned, with say Wenbanyama. And again, like in terms of the effort, the defense is okay, but I just feel like if he can continue to improve that, that'll really help. Because again, he's got the potential as a creator, like I mentioned, and like you mentioned with Gregory. But at the same time, if he can, like I said, with a lot of these guys, if they can improve in some of the other aspects of their game that they're not quite as good at, that's where they can really help out. So that's
Yes.
another guy that I have mentioned. Again, as a potential second round guy that could maybe help out a team if they
Yeah,
can pan out and continue to develop.
I agree.
So that's pretty much our draft, our mock draft. Analysis for the first round. Again, we're not really going to go into the second round. We mentioned the sleepers, but like you said, the podcast is so long enough as it is. And most people when they do mock drafts, usually most of the the meat of the discussion is in the first round. Just because the second round, anything could happen, right? There are many guys who get picked in the second round who don't even actually end up playing. Right. So the first round is really where you need to hit.
Yes.
On these guys. So, with the mock draft pretty much done, we're gonna get into some more news around the league. So obviously we had some big stories come up. Obviously in addition to the Beal thing, we had the Ja Morant suspension for 25 games.
Yeah.
This was kind of the announcement that everybody was kind of waiting for, right? Adam Silver, the commissioner, mentioned, before the finals that he didn't really want to, talk about it, during the finals, because he didn't want to take away attention from it, which again, I don't think it would have really made that big of a difference. But,
Yeah.
um, regardless, 25 games, we know the issue. He was on IG Live with
Yeah.
the gun, flashing around. We don't have to talk about it too
Right.
much.
They
But
did say it
obviously,
was a toy though. They did
yeah,
confirm that as well. Definitely
yeah,
confirmed
exactly.
it.
Right. Yeah. So obviously, again, the fact that, he's repeating similar ish type of actions isn't great.
Yeah.
And again, clearly the NBA thought, hey, something's not right here because, they gave him the suspension. That's
Cuckoo.
about what I thought it was probably going to be. Because we know with Bridges, I think he was hit with 30 games, right? And I didn't think it was going to be more than that.
Mm-mm.
Um, some people, it's kind of interesting, where it seems like a lot of fans online feel like the suspension length was too lenient. And then when you look at, some of the players and then maybe some of the more like media savvy people, they feel like the suspension was too significant.
Right.
So kind of interesting to see. Like I said, I feel like this is fine, right?
Yeah, I
Like I
don't
don't
have a problem
need
with
it
it.
to go much more than that. And it definitely shouldn't have been as uh lenient as the first suspension. If I'm not mistaken, the Players Association, it seems like they're gonna see if they can try to appeal it. I'm curious to see where that goes.
Just
Um,
leave it alone. Let him do his time.
yeah, just he needs to kind of take this time to figure some stuff out.
Yes.
Because again, when he's on the floor, he's really good. But again, these off the court issues, that's a problem. And that's something he's got to fix. Even not even just because he had the apology, talking about I'm sorry to the young kids, that I'm a
Right.
big influence on, but also just for him personally, right? Like just putting himself in precarious situations. That's just not a great thing. Um, it's just not a good position to put yourself in. Again, he's young. Young people do make mistakes, but he's got to figure this stuff out. In terms of how it impacts Memphis, we know for the regular season, they haven't really had too many issues, in terms of when Ja's out. They have a really, solid winning percentage when he's out there or, when he's not playing. So it probably won't impact them that much, for the regular season. It's more so playoffs where it's going to hurt you. Um, but again, I feel like the suspension is probably the right thing to do because again, you can't just let it slide,
Right.
because it could potentially get worse. But I also understand like you don't want to suspend him for like 40, ish, or more games, right? Because some people were like, suspend him the entire season. That was never
No.
happened.
No.
So I
It
feel
would have
like
been
this is
different if he did something far, far worse.
right, exactly. Um, so moving on, Mike Dunleavy Jr., right? Former NBA player. Had ties to the Warriors, used to play there. Now he is replacing Bob Myers as the new GM for the Warriors.
Okay.
Um, it was kind of interesting because some people thought it might be the team governor Joe Lacob's son. But I feel like they both kind of share, I think, sort of those administrative responsibilities. Those two guys were very high on Jordan Poole, right? They reportedly were a big factor, according to the Athletic, in terms of having him, wanting to keep him around and have that big extension. But they got their work cut out for them, obviously, right? Because Golden State obviously disappointed this year. They were the defending champs the year before, right? Came up short this year. And again, they're in a weird spot where they have their older core, that probably, again, only probably has like a season or two more where they're probably, could realistically compete for the championship.
Yeah.
Um, and at the same time, you also have this other interesting aspect where you have some young guys, right? Where it would be great if they could help you out right now, right? But they didn't really help you out that much last year. So do you
Exactly.
stick with them, and let them, to continue to develop, knowing that you may have to wait? Um, or do you just kind of move them for an impact player? Again, like, there's a lot of questions that Golden State has. What do you do with Draymond? What do you do with Clay? Right? Draymond reportedly he's gonna opt out. Right. So I'm assuming he's probably going to re-sign with the Warriors. But again, you know, what do they do with that? With a lot of these questions. So again, for me personally, I don't usually like putting these big type of decisions in the hands of a rookie GM.
Right.
But again, it's kind of like with the Wizards, right? Like these guys, they're given these types of jobs for a reason. Um, so hopefully, he can kind of, fix up some of these issues for the Warriors. But again, without knowing, too much of his background, other than like I said, the pool thing. Again, I just feel like it's still a loss for in terms of Bob Myers leaving Golden State. But we'll see. Because again, Dunleavy, he's got the opportunity now, to kind of lead Golden State into, a new era. Because regardless of what they do, I don't think they have too many more years of title contention left.
No.
So you need to think about the future anyways. Um, and again, like, maybe he can do that.
Yeah, I'm a little bit more skeptical for the Warriors and the path that they're going to take than the Wizards, I think, just mainly due to the fact that they do have some really, really big contending pieces. Obviously Steph, Draymond, and Clay. But, I'm curious to see what they do in the offseason, especially considering this luxury tax and the CBA stuff. So they
Yeah,
definitely have
that's
some
something.
huge decisions to make.
Yeah,
And that's a hefty load for a rookie. You never want to put that much pressure on somebody. But hey, he gets paid to do that. So, I do have some confidence in him, but I'm still more skeptical on him than I am, other GM situations.
right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like you said, because it's just again, you don't usually like the idea of having smart guys leave,
Right.
good organizations. But again, you got to give him a chance, see what he can do. But like you said, it's kind of interesting because with the Wizards, we know they're going to rebuild.
Yeah.
Whereas with the Warriors, they're not going to rebuild right now.
Right.
But again, probably within the next few seasons, they're going to have to
Exactly.
because again, with the aging core, I just don't think that they have a realistic means to contend for a championship
No,
full
it's not
season long.
solid enough.
Yeah, exactly. So it's going to be interesting to keep an eye on that as they kind of move towards this new era for Golden State.
Hmm.
Um Another rumor, right? Fred Van Vliet. He's expected to command more than 30 million. Um that's a lot of money for Fred Van Vliet. I do think he's a good player. But at the same time, he is a small guard. He's getting older. He's, close to 30 right at this point. So how much better is he going to get? He's probably going to start declining
Yeah.
at this point in his career. Like I said, as a Laker guy, I know his name came up in rumors. I wasn't really interested in acquiring him. Because again, I figured he would hit free agency. You'd have to do a sign and trade. I don't think he's a bad, like I said, I don't think he's a bad player at year last year. So I think your hope is if he goes to a good team that he'll, be better because he'll be playing with more talent
Yeah.
and he won't be, kind of like the primary, perimeter guy. I guess Siakam was, right? But, he's the main lead guard ball handler, right? Clear cut number two guy for them last year. So I feel like in a different situation, you'll probably get a better version of him. But I'm just really skeptical about giving him a long term deal with at a ton of money when he's already pushing 30 and he's probably gonna, he's definitely not gonna get any better.
Yeah.
Maybe, be a little bit more efficient, but in terms of the skill set, probably gonna start declining soon.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. Van Vliet, I feel like it's just a case of you got to know your worth. And I think he's shooting a little bit too high, if you ask me. I'm not sure how much interest he has around the league, but I'm sure Toronto's not willing to shill out, that $30 million that he's asking for. That's a lot of money, in my opinion, for Freddie.
Especially because again, I think Toronto is probably looking to probably rebuild as
That's
well.
my point. So it's
And I
like,
just
it's
don't,
rough.
yeah. And I just don't think again, it's kind of like what we mentioned with Kuzma. You don't necessarily want to spend that much money,
It's
um,
unrealistic.
on a rebuild situation.
It's
Um,
completely unrealistic.
More rumors, multiple teams eyeing Jonathan Kaminga. Again, we've heard this before, from a variety of sources. Right, where the Warriors, we know they're looking to explore, any types of trades that they can make, that can improve their team. Because again, it makes sense. You got Steph, you got Clay, you got Draymond. Like you mentioned, you have a lot of contending pieces. Um, but again, in terms of that supporting cast, right, the bench, the depth, it's just not there like it was the year before. So you got to improve. Again, Kaminga, I think, is fine. I think some people are high on him, some people aren't. I feel like he probably would be more likely to help like a young team probably than a team like Golden State, just because I feel like he's still kind of raw. I know he's improved in some
Yes.
aspects, but it still feels like he's got a lot of room to grow. So I feel like if Golden State makes a trade, he might be the most likely guy just because I think he still has a high level of value as a former lottery pick. Um, but again, we'll see what happens because, like you said, with the CBA and the new areas that they have to navigate, it'll be interesting, to kind of see what they can pull off, if any. Because we've already seen, probably the biggest move of the offseason with Bradley Beal. So can Golden State, pass something like that? We'll see. It doesn't have to be that level, right? But
Yeah.
what can they do? Considering they do have, a massive contract in Jordan Poole that they could probably trade. Um, but with Poole, it is interesting because I don't think they can trade him and get a ton back before the draft because again, his big contract doesn't roll over, I think, until July 1st, which is after.
Right.
So right now, if you trade Kaminga and Poole together, that's not going to net you like a big salary guy, just because again, like their contracts are still relatively small right now. Right, Poole was a late first, Kaminga's a lottery pick, right? But again, the seventh pick isn't going to make as much as like a veteran in his like sixth or seventh year.
Yeah, I agree. Kaminga, he has high value, high upside in terms of the athletic ability. I feel like the shot needs some work still, but you know, I I'm pretty high on him. I was and still am high on him, when he first got drafted. But it might be time for him to maybe get out of Golden State and maybe fulfill a larger role. I think that's probably what he's
Yeah,
seeking because it seems like they just didn't utilize him. And that's kind of
ex-
unfortunate because he had potential and still does for sure. So I feel like,
yeah,
maybe on a bad team, he could potentially,
exactly.
showcase what he's got. But
That's
right
what
now,
I'm
I
thinking.
think Golden State is a bad fit for him. Simple as
Yeah,
that.
that's what I'm thinking. I'm just thinking he's probably a little bit too raw,
Yes.
to help out Golden State right now. But I think he could play on, like you said, a bad team or like just a rebuilding team, a
Sure.
young team.
Yeah.
Where
Come
he's
to the
not
Wizards,
like,
mate.
yeah, exactly, where he's not expected, to pick up every aspect of the
Right.
game. right now, right? To give him some time to grow. Because again, he's basically gone 2 seasons on a playoff team and not playing, and he hasn't played in the playoffs at all. And even
Exactly.
during the regular season, he didn't play like, consistently. He had a lot of stretches where he didn't really play at all. He had stretches where he did and then others where he didn't. It was so inconsistent.
Yeah.
And that's a tough position to be in as a young player, especially again, he's going to be in his third season. So, you go into next off season is when he'll be looking for that rookie extension.
Yeah.
Um, right. And right now he just probably hasn't played enough, to really get that, certainly from Golden State. And especially again,
Exactly.
with their CBA, are they even going to pay him? So, we'll see. I feel like he's probably, headed towards more of like a rebuilding team.
Yes.
Um, again, a lot of these rumors are coming from Action Network. So to continue that, a couple of rumors from the Blazers. Jeremy Grant, Blazers probably going to resign.
Good.
$120 million deal. That's a lot of money for Jeremy Grant. Again, I do
Yeah.
like Jeremy Grant. That's a lot of money. And again with Portland, I just don't understand what the point of what they're doing is. It just doesn't make any sense. I just don't think you're going to contend with Lillard with the Blazers. I just don't think their roster is good enough. It can get better for sure, but
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to be good enough to, come out of the West. Because again, we just saw, again, a team like Phoenix improve. I don't think there's anything Portland can do, to get on, Phoenix or Denver or LA, or even Golden State's level. I just don't see that. Um, unless they pull some rabbit out of a hat trade, maybe they get like Porzingis from Washington or something like that. But even then, like, I just don't know what they're gonna do. But that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
Yeah. That's a weird thing. I mean, I guess
Yeah,
congrats to
I
him for
guess you
getting the
could.
bag, but that's a lot of
Yeah,
money, man. Holy
yeah.
crap. For a
I mean, I
player in
guess.
his tier, I don't
Yeah,
know.
I mean, I guess you got to bring him back, to so that way you don't just give him up for nothing. They didn't really give up anything really to get him. I think it was
Right.
just a first from Milwaukee, so it wasn't like they gave up a ton to get him. But I don't know. Like if you're like again for me, like I said, if I'm Portland, like I said, I'm trading Lillard, rebuilding, probably just
Simple as
letting
that.
Jeremy walk, and just kind of rolling with the young guys there. But again, I'm not running Portland.
I
Clearly,
feel like it's all dependent on where, what Charlotte does with this number two pick. I really do.
yeah, exactly. And who knows if Portland doesn't trade that pick and they keep it, maybe that forces Lillard's hand. Maybe wanting out. We'll see. They have
Yeah.
a ton of things going on, so we just don't know. Um, again, moving on. According to Hoops Hype, rivals are monitoring Raptors. Kind of an interesting scenario. It also sounded like they were also a lot of teams have been worn out where they just don't know what Toronto's going to do.
Right.
And I feel like we've kind of been in that position. We talked about we didn't know what the heck they were going to do at the deadline because there were so many rumors about them maybe blowing it up. And then they ended up sort of, buying at the deadline where they got Yaka Pirtle. So I don't have really like a strong grasp or a strong sense of what they're gonna do. It does feel like they're gonna at least say goodbye to some guys with Van Vliet, and potentially Gary Trent Jr. But who knows? Maybe they trade on Anobi elsewhere. There's rumors about him. Maybe he could get moved to say like Sacramento,
Right.
which I think would be huge for Sacramento if they could pull that off.
Yeah, that would be
Uh,
insane.
but I just don't know. I like there's just so much uncertainty with them. Like I said, I feel like they should definitely rebuild. I just again I don't know what they're gonna do because again they I could see them talking themselves potentially into hey we were good a couple years ago, but I could also see them just rebuilding, and I feel like that's probably where they should go. Just because again I don't feel like the roster as currently constructed is good enough to where you make a few tweaks and then you're right there with the top of the East. Like you're
Yeah.
not getting it. So you might
Yeah.
as well just start over.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's rough, but a rebuild is definitely inevitable because there's no way. Like, I mean, with that roster, I feel like you just can't compete. And say you do, make it out of the East, which is probably not going to happen. But say you do, and then it's like once you get to the West, it's pretty much a wash, in my opinion. But that's just my opinion. So
Really. Um, So again, according to Mark Stein, Malcolm Brogdon is more likely to be traded than Marcus Smart, Derek White, or even Peyton Pritchard. So that's kind of interesting.
huh,
He was the sixth man of the year, right? He
huh,
was really good for Boston, this year. And then, but then, I guess you kind of factor in, the age, the injuries, the contract. Maybe in terms of value, maybe more teams would want Brogdon, than other teams. I know he was kind of a name that was mentioned as a potential Phoenix target. Probably not happening now that, they
yeah,
got
no,
Beal. But I do feel like there's a lot of teams that would want Brogdon just because again he's a solid guard, that does a lot of different things. at a high level, as a shooter, as a playmaker. His issue for him is his health. He just has a big problem in terms of staying healthy. He got hurt, at the end of this Boston playoff run.
You could
Um,
see it in his shot. It looked god awful.
yeah, exactly. And yeah, so it's just I think he had what was it, an elbow issue, I think?
Yeah, I think it was elbow and shoulder or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, that's kind of the issue with him. And again, that's probably not going to change. He's already over 30. So I could see Boston maybe doing it. It's just odd because like it just seemed like he was such a key piece for them. And it almost feels like maybe you might want to trade say like Smart,
Yeah,
but
that's
at the
what I
same
was
time,
thinking.
yeah, but at this, it just feels like one of those guards is going to go because I feel like you have too many guards. And I feel like you kind of need to consolidate that and move one of them. According to him, he thinks Brogdon's the most likely, but we'll have to see. Because again, like you have a decent amount of options. Because any of those guards I think can fit in Boston.
Yeah,
But again, also I guess if you're Boston, you're factoring and maybe you want to prioritize youth. Again, I think it depends on who's the most valuable. And again, maybe Brogdon's the most valuable. I don't know.
yeah,
But again, I think any one of these guys could be a candidate to be moved. But according to him, he thinks it's Brogdon.
yeah. I think Marcus Smart is definitely a guy that should be moved. Excuse me.
But
Thanks. But yeah, I think Marcus Smart should definitely be the guy who gets moved, or even Derek White. But I feel like Pritchard is solid too, but it seems like he kind of wants out. But I don't know, and it's like I would prefer to keep Brogdon just because of how valuable he is. But who knows? That may be just my Wizards way of thinking, and we tend to keep guys for a little bit too long. So maybe get him while his value's a little higher, coming off the sixth man of the year.
yeah, another rumor that's been going around. I think according to Jake Fisher, Hawks Siakam. It's not necessarily that it's going to happen, but it's just a rumor of Atlanta, kind of reaching out.
Okay.
Because again, we don't know what Toronto is going to do. There's been
Right.
so many different types of things going on, so many conflicting reports. It would be interesting. I'm assuming John Collins is probably the guy who'd get moved to Toronto. Obviously he had a rough season for Atlanta this
Right.
year. So I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. If you're Atlanta again, you're in a position where you gave up a ton of picks, right? So blowing it up and rebuilding is probably not that likely. Um, but it is rumored that nobody's safe other than Trey Young, which is kind of interesting because a little earlier in the season, right, it was kind of suggested that no one is safe at all, even Trey Young himself.
Right.
Um, Again, I didn't feel like Trey Young was going to go anywhere. I just don't know how many. I feel like a lot of teams probably look at his contract as like, I don't know if we want that.
Yeah, not
So
for
I
that
feel like
efficiency. No.
yeah. And again, the defense not really there. So I don't know. I feel like he's probably not going anywhere. Again, they restructured the coaching staff, with Quinn Snyder. So I feel like Siakam would be an interesting get. Um, but again, like it's just what are you getting back from Atlanta if you're Toronto? Like I said, I
Right.
guess I guess John Collins, but I feel like
Even then.
Siakam could maybe get you back a little bit more,
Yeah.
in terms of picks because he's a really good player. And he had a great season for Toronto, so I feel like his value is probably relatively high. But again, we
Right.
just saw Beal go for a bag of chips and a Twinkie. So I mean, yeah. So I
Yeah.
mean, again, his situation is different because he could dictate where he could go. But I do kind of wonder if we see like sort of a market reset in terms of these trades, right? Because we saw Gobert, last year get traded for basically diamonds, right? So is that going to happen again?
Dejounte Murray.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So maybe this offseason we see a little bit more of a reset, but we'll have to see. I definitely think there's going to be a high number of trades this offseason because, again, as we've talked about in the past, the free agent market isn't that great. There's not that many high level free agents out there. So if you're looking to improve, like we saw with Phoenix, it's probably going to have to be through trades.
Yeah.
Because, again, a lot of the top free agents, you look at them, a number of them are either restricted guys or they're just not that great. They're not worth giving a lot of money to, in my opinion.
Yes.
So it's going to be interesting to see how these teams restructure. Even again, teams like Atlanta where they're way over the cap. So again, trades is what they're going to have. They have no cap.
Yeah, I agree.
Um, Another one, uh, Mavericks and John Collins. According to Jake Fisher, this was something that was discussed. Ultimately, didn't go anywhere.
Okay,
Um,
I was gonna say.
if it's the 10th pick, yeah, I don't know about that one. Like I said, I like John
No.
Collins. We both like him, but again, it's was a rough season for him.
His
You know, he
value's too low, bro.
exactly. He would help Dallas, I think, but again, like they also need defense, from their bigs, and that's not really what Collins does. Not a terrible defensive guy, right? But I feel like if you're Dallas, wings, defense, that's what you need to prioritize if you're going to be trading that 10th pick, which it sounds like they are going to do. I don't know. I don't think I would do that if I'm Dallas, but again, well, I
No.
don't. I just don't know what the value of the 10th pick is.
Yeah, that's a no go for me.
Yeah. Another rumor. Hornets prefer Bi over Zion, according to Stein. Kind of an interesting thing because we had heard for a little while, right, that Zion could be moved. I don't think it's gonna happen. Um,
No, I don't think so.
I just feel like when he plays, he's just really really good, and I don't think it's time to give up on him just yet.
Mm-mm.
Now again, if he has some issues going into next season, and this stuff happens again, right, then you can think about it. But you know, right now, I don't know. I just
Yeah,
wouldn't do it.
I,
But it
I
is
wouldn't
interesting.
either.
Yeah, but it is interesting preferring Bi over Zion. I guess like when you look at Charlotte, they probably do need wings. And obviously Ingram is more of a wing than Zion, who's more of a big. Um, so I could see that. And again with Charlotte, as I guess we can get into this right. The sale seems like it's finally, pretty much done,
Yeah,
with the new owners coming in, or excuse me, team governors coming in. So they're probably looking, to make a big splash. Like I said, I don't think Zion's going to get traded to Charlotte. But I do think with the new ownership, it'll be interesting to see what Charlotte does. Obviously, it begins with the draft. But we know new owners like to make big splashes. We saw, with Phoenix, we saw them get Kevin Durant and now get Bradley Beal.
right.
Uh, right? So we saw with Minnesota, right? They got new ownership, right? And then they, made a splash, in the other direction and got Rudy Gobert. Um, so, I could see them doing something kind of wild at the draft, but I just don't see the Zion one. I just don't feel like that's gonna happen.
No, it's not. I don't think. I think it's a 0% chance, just mainly due to the fact that
Right?
just because of Zion's value, I don't think New Orleans is willing to, just throw that away. I think they're not going to give up on him that easily.
Yeah, like we know reportedly that New Orleans wants Scoot, but like I don't know if I'm not ready to like move on from Zion, to get
Maybe
Scoot.
Bi for Scoot, but I don't know. Even then,
Right, exactly. Moving on, sounds like that Christian Wood's time in Dallas is probably done.
hmm
With no good in Dallas. Um, so obviously, he kind of had an interesting season for them where he started off playing really well. And it seemed like he was probably gonna, be re-signed on a longer term deal, right? Talks of an extension, but after a while, it seemed like he kind of just fell out of favor in Dallas. I think the defensive issues have been a concern. We know he kind of fell out of favor in Houston, so maybe there's some potential, personal concerns as well. In terms of the chemistry. I mean, again, I think he's a fine player, right? I think his value is probably, dropped in the last few seasons where I think a lot of people looked at him as probably being a lot better than he actually is. Because again, profile, it's, in on paper, he's a really intriguing player, right? Because he's almost 7 feet tall with a decent handle, with a decent jump shot, and decent athleticism. But again, the defense just hasn't been there. He's he spent a decent amount of time the last few years with injuries. So I just feel like it's a gamble. But again, if you're Dallas, that's rough because again, you traded for a guy and got basically nothing for it, nothing out of him, and now you're gonna let him go. They didn't
yeah,
give up much to get him, but again, it sucks. If you're a team that makes a gamble on a guy and it doesn't pay off, right? Because again, we talked about it before. They let Jalen Brunson go, and basically said, well, we'll replace him with Christian Wood, so we'll be okay. But again, with Wood being no good in Dallas, it's just unfortunate because again, like
yeah,
you're basically coming away with nothing, right?
yeah.
Again, we talked about it, right? They messed up with the Brunson thing, and since then it's just been a comedy of errors, in just the worst possible way, where you make a panic trade for Kyrie and that doesn't pan out either, and now you're probably forced into giving him a bunch of money long term, which I don't think any other team really wants to do.
No,
Uh, and then you have to factor that in, right? You're now a worse team because you gave up other things to get Kyrie. And so now you kind of have to, pivot on the fly, and that's always a rough position to be in. But they put themselves in that position.
it's
So,
sad, dude. Like Christian Wood's decent, I think, but good lord, this is bad. Dallas is in shambles for me.
again, with our last rumor, Cam Johnson is a target for the Pistons. according to Jake Fisher. Kind of an interesting, right? Because again, you could always use some more wings. Again, they have Bogdanovich, but with his age, I feel like you wouldn't look at him as a long term piece. They
Right.
did sign him an extension, but I feel like that also gives them flexibility as a guy that maybe they could potentially trade.
Mm-hmm.
But again, we had been there, done that. His name came up, in rumors basically every day. To the point that he was pretty much a household name.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know. I mean, again, if you're Detroit, I'm fine with that. They could all, they need more shooting. They need more,
Yeah.
guys because they have way too many bigs. I think, and especially a number of bigs that don't really shoot that well. Right. And again, if you're adding, the top potentially one of the Thompson guys in the draft, right, then that complicates it even more. So Cam Johnson is a terrific shooter. So I think that's a pretty solid get. But I feel like also if I'm Brooklyn, just bring him back. Because
Yeah.
I don't feel like he's going to cost a ton. Um, and again, he fits what you want. If you're Brooklyn, right? It seems like they love having a number of versatile shooters out there. So just bring him back. Because
Yeah.
I just again, if you're Brooklyn, I think they're already over the cap, so they're not going to be able to replace him with somebody if he walks. So I feel
Yeah.
like he's probably just going to go back to Brooklyn. Unless Detroit gives him a really really high overpay of a contract, which I just don't see them doing.
Yeah. And Cam Johnson's one of those guys where it's like, he kind of feeds off of the energy of his teammates. So, if Bridges is going off, he's probably going to be solid as well. So that's kind of, I don't know. I just wouldn't break that up. I kind of like that in Brooklyn. But, if you're getting something solid in return, I mean, maybe, yeah.
Well, that pretty much wraps it up for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, we talked about a lot. Of course, we covered, the Beal trade, the draft, in terms of the mock draft, and a number of rumors. So again, another long one. And then again, it's we appreciate the support, appreciate everybody sticking around again, and it's gonna get even longer, right? Because
Yeah.
again, remember, we're gonna have the live stream, covering the draft. We're gonna go live, probably 15, 20 minutes or so before the draft. So hang out, and talk to us. We're going to be live reacting, to all the picks, from number 1 to number 58 cuz, interestingly enough, there's only 58 picks this time, not 60 because Philadelphia and Chicago couldn't keep quiet about their free agency acquisitions.
Yeah.
Um so again, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Thanks for listening. Have a hopefully you had a great Father's Day. Hopefully you have a fun Juneteenth. So again, either we'll see you with the live stream on Thursday, or you'll catch a Friday's episode.